Bridie, Praveen Anand's been on the phone to me. He can't get in.
You are now live.
Ready all?
Go ahead, Mr. Mayor. Now.
7 o'clock.
Yeah,
Sam?
you can begin, Mr. Mayor.
Welcome to all members of the council, as well as members of the public who may be watching online. Before the meeting formally begins, Reverend Julia Jagan of Oak Tree Christian Fellowship will bless the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Lord and Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for all that has been and is being accomplished through the work of this council during these challenging times. We give thanks for the work of the Mayor, the Deputy Mayor, the Leader, councillors, the Chief Executive and all staff for their commitment and diligence. We commit this evening's proceedings to your loving care and our guidance. They have an important agenda in front of them, and Lord, they need your guidance to know what to do, so we ask for that. We trust in you for the right decisions to be made. Where there are disagreements, we ask for grace to listen and disagree well. We pray that the voices at the margins are placed at the centre, particularly as test and trace and domestic violence are being considered on this agenda. Loving God, may every effort be made to ensure every person and community in our borough is able to flourish. Now to the final blessing. The blessing of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit be with you and those you love and care for, today and evermore. Amen. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Julia. Now we get into the agenda. Item 1, apologies for absence and attendance. Are there any apologies for absence?
Mr. Mayor, I have had apologies for lateness from Councillor Ball. He may not join us till about 8 o'clock. I haven't had any apologies for absence. In terms of attendance, I thought it'd be easier if I read those members who aren't in attendance at the moment. There may be some members that are sharing devices, and I'll just ask for them to confirm that's the case once I've read out the list of those who I can't see are in the meeting at the moment. So at the moment, those who aren't in attendance are Councillor Ball, Councillor Nagpal, Councillor Kay Crawford, Councillor Cox, Councillor Ranjit Deer and Councillor Darmy. Are there any members who are present who are sharing a device at the moment? No. Okay, so those 6 councillors are the only ones who aren't present at the moment, and I'll make a record of that.
Item 2, declarations of interest. Are there any declaration of interest?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, this is Councillor Anand here. I have a declaration of interest for tonight. It's on the Heathrow expansion. I will leave the meeting and I hope somebody will write me back once the discussion is over. That's a pecuniary interest, Mr. Mayor.
Any more?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, Councillor Bell here. There's a question about TfL's finances, and being a member of TfL's board, I've asked Councillor Sabiers if he will take that question. Also, there are some later questions that I will be answering about LTNs, and I propose to deal with them in the same way that I did in terms of making that declaration as a member of TfL's board. I have, whenever any funding for local authorities, including Ealing Council, has been discussed or decided upon at TfL's board, I've recused myself and not taken part in any of those discussions or decisions. So I'm able to answer those questions about LTNs later. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Any more? Councillor Rooney?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll have to the meeting, and we'll be able to vote or speak on the motion on the test and trace system because of a pecuniary interest. So hopefully someone to invite me back into the meeting afterwards. Thank you.
Councillor Mahfouz?
Mr. Mayor.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So just a pecuniary interest in relation to the opposition motion. So the safe thing and recuse myself at that point of the meeting and come back in later.
Mr. Mayor, as chair of the planning committee, many planning committee members are intending not to be present when the motion is discussed because it may cause a problem for us in terms of future planning applications. The motion does have reference to a live planning application. So my advice to planning committee members would be to please not be at the meeting at that time and leave. But I will be leaving the meeting because it could prejudice us in terms of future planning decisions. Thank you.
Thanks. Can Sam actually list those names later on when we come to it?
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah.
So, Mr. Mayor, I wish to make a declaration of interest on question 7 of the oral questions to members, as well as to offer a personal explanation under 1414 of the Council's procedural rules, which I believe has been notified to you. I understand that at the emergency full council last week, my pecuniary interest was raised by Councillor Stafford. Having reviewed the playback, Councillor Stafford's comments came quite close to alleging misconduct in public office, although I do thank him for giving me a promotion. For the avoidance of any doubt, I do hold a pecuniary interest in relation to my employer. This is listed within my register of members' disclosable pecuniary interests received and published by the monitoring officer in March of this year. Councillor Stafford first raised the query with the monitoring officer in relation to that pecuniary interest on the 21st of September. The monitoring officer responded on the 6th of October to Councillor Stafford and Councillor Milliken, confirming that I had made the declaration of pecuniary interest in my register of members' interests, that I had no involvement in any decision or procurement exercise, either in my capacity as a councillor or, for that matter, for my employer, and that the digital engagement contract formed no part of the 16th of June cabinet paper, and that neither digital engagement projects or the LTNs, for that matter, fell within the portfolio that I no longer hold. The monitoring officer also included a copy of the officer decision taken by the chief executive that said the same. I understand that the monitoring officers also supplied the same to Councillor Busuttil. Having been made aware of these facts, neither Councillor Stafford, Milliken or Busuttil have qualified privilege, and I will consider any further inferences of misconduct as having been made with malice, to which they should expect I will respond to. And I will be withdrawing for that question from the meeting.
Okay, thank you very much, Mason. Councillor Dabrowska. Hello.
Thank you, Mayor. I would like to just raise a declaration with regards to the Heathrow motion. I have 2 pensions that benefit from Heathrow's commercial operations. However, the motion is about democracy rather than policy in Heathrow, so it's not pecuniary, but I would like to make a declaration for public record. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any more declaration of interest? Okay, now item 3. Matters to be considered in private,
There are none that we're aware of, Mr. Mayor.
Item 4, minutes. Are the minutes of the meeting held on 21st July 2020 agreed as a correct record of proceedings?
Agreed.
Agreed. Agreed.
Mr. Mr. Mayor, it's Councillor Stafford here. I would wish to raise a point of order on the minutes, if it's appropriate to do so. At the last full council meeting, we had a motion on the Conservative motion not for debate on local democracy and the recording and live streaming of videos of the council meetings. In that, full council agreed unanimously that a report should be brought to the October cabinet meeting. No report came to the October cabinet meeting. So I ask you and maybe the chief executive what we can do about officers or members of the cabinet not complying with council's direct request to have a report brought to that cabinet meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Mayor, would you like me to respond? And the monitoring officer might want to add. First of all, if there's an oversight on behalf of officers, which it sounds like there may be, can I apologise if there was a decision made at the last council, a request made that we've not complied with. Again, let me apologise on behalf of officers if there's been any oversight, and I'm very happy to pick that up after this evening and make sure we take any necessary action. So please let me apologise if there's been an oversight, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. Now, Mayor's announcements. I want to begin by offering my sincere condolences to the family and friends of the two people who were tragically killed in the explosion in Kings Street, Southall, earlier this week. Please join me in a minute's silence to mark their loss.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is with great sadness that I announce the passing of a former councillor, past mayor of Ealing, and past master of the worshipful company of friars and former magistrate, Diana Begin, aged 83 years. Diana Begin was born in June 1937, died 24th of August 2020. Diana was a Conservative councillor for the Reverend ward from 82 to 86. She was elected as a councillor the Pittshangle ward from 1990 to 2002 and was the Hanger Hill ward councillor from 2002 to 2014. Diana was appointed as the mayor of Ealing in 2006-2007. Diana died peacefully following a short illness and complications from Alzheimer's disease. Will the Conservative group rep to say a few words, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I had known Diana through the council for more than 40 years. We served together as councillors for a long while, being ward colleagues for much of that time. Diana had two spells on the council, 82 to 86 and 1990 to 2014, 28 years in all, with her taking the mayoralty in 2006. On the council, Diana did not speak often, but when she did speak, it was always most effective. And as a ward councillor, Diana's hard work for her constituents was much appreciated, and woe betide any council officer who didn't respond promptly to an inquiry. I was very fortunate to have visited Diana just before lockdown. Although I had been warned by her caretaker that Diana's mental acuity was compromised, I was pleased to be able to have a long conversation with full understanding, the only difficulty being Diana's limited speaking ability. Diana was always reliable and was an effective participant, either as a magistrate, as a councillor, or as a master of her city livery company, the Worshipful Company of Farriers. I know that with her passing, Diana will leave a gap in our hearts. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor Young. On Friday, 2nd October, the Metropolitan Police observed a minute's silence in remembrance.
Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
So, dear, could I say a few words on behalf of the Labour Group in the memory of past Mayor Diana Pagan, please?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Unmute you.
Your microphone, Councillor Dheer, your microphone is not working.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Mr. Mayor, I rise to say a few words by way of a tribute to the life and work of past Mayor Councillor Diana Pagan and words of condolences to her family. Mr. Mayor, Councillor Diana Pagan actually became a councillor in the same year in 1982 as I did in the last century. And she served our council in many roles, in many committee settings. And during those years, Mr. Mayor, we had a committee system, and Diana served with great distinction as chairman of Education Committee and mayor in 2005 and 2006. As Councillor Young has said, Diana was actually a woman of very few words. She was very measured and a very dignified, reserved person. In those days, we all the councillors of all parties shared the same members' room, and so every now and then you spoke to Diana, but she spoke a few words, but she always gave you a good smile. In fact, she belonged to an era of politics when our politics wasn't too loud or too aggressive. That was the person that Diana was. I also, Mr. Mayor, knew Diana in her work as a magistrate because I was also a member of the local bench at the same time. In fact, Diana was chair of the youth court and I was her deputy chairman for several years. And there too, Diana had the same ethos of great public service as a magistrate and a member of the bench. Mr. Mayor, to conclude, I would say that I spoke to Diana's daughter, Claire, when she died on the 24th of August, and I asked Claire whether Diana was ill. And Claire told me that, yes, Ranjit, Diana, my mother was ill for a short period, and there were complications in terms of her Alzheimer's illness. But she said that she never complained. She never complained, and she was a dignified lady to the very end. May Diana Pagan rest in peace, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On Friday, 2nd October, the Metropolitan Police observed 1 minute silence in remembrance of murdered Metropolitan Police Sergeant Matt Ratana. Please join me for a minute silence to reflect, remember, and pay tribute to him.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, your mic is mute. Yeah.
It's with great sadness that I announce the passing of past Mayor Marianne Elliott as the Mayor of Ealing 2005-2006, an alderman for 8 years and a former chair of the Amenities Committee. She was a long-serving school governor in Berry Vale, Greenford area. Marianne Elliott passed away in July 23rd. Please join me in 1 minute silence for Diana Deegan.
Mr. Mayor, Mayor, I'm going to say a few words about Alderman Elliott.
Very few, it was in the list. Okay, carry on, yeah.
Thank you very much. A point of correction, Marion Elliott wasn't Mayor of the Borough. Julia Clement Elliott was Mayor of the Borough. So just to talk about Marion briefly, I knew Marion since I joined the Labour Party. She also lived only a few roads away from me in Greenford. We also went to the same church. Marion was my key endorser back in 2014, so you all have her to thank for me being a member of the council. But Marion was obviously a very warm and wonderful person. Her time on the council was as an alderman, and one of her many stories was when back in 1968 she when a Labour seat was likely to be lost, piles of votes were found under a table, and I think that gave a Labour victory in 1968. Her home, well, her life was rooted in the community, and like you said, Mr. Mayor, she was very active in Perryville. She met Mike Elliott and they married, and they set up home in Greenford in Chinner Crescent. Her home, we have counted, was a general election committee room on at least 5 occasions, one of which included Jim Hudson, who was the Labour MP for Ealing North from 1950 to 1955. So I defy anybody that could go back that far. She also showed me what a Mikado pad was. For those of you who don't know, there was a by-election in Reading where Ian Mikado won a seat, and they used what's known as Reading Mikado pads, and that was the sort of pilot for get out the vote. Marion was, say, very active locally. She was a school governor at John Fisher Primary School in Perryville for many, many years, and I only think she gave that up when Councillor Mahmood was elected and then became a governor at St John Fisher. So she wasn't going to let go until someone like Councillor Mahmood was ready to take over. Her occupation was a secretary. She worked in Acton College, which then merged with Brunel in Hillingdon. And she'd often talk about the time she would bring party paperwork from Brunel, and she'd print stuff off and take it to Sid Bidwell, who lived in Long Lane in Hillingdon. So she had plenty of stories from lots, many, many years. In the last years, Marion's memory did go, but her humour remained. And a bit like Councillor Pagan, who we talked about today, she never let it label her, her dementia, and her very philosophical about it. You know, she said she's had a good innings, never let it define her for 1 minute. Marion passed in July. She did sort of have an infection and caught COVID and got better, did stabilise, but a recovery was always very unlikely, and she did pass away in July. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend the funeral because of limitation on numbers, and it's been very challenging for people. My own father died over the summer, and very few people could get to the funeral. So I just thought I'd take a few moments to remember her. And in the words of the title of the Leonard Cohen song, "So long, Marianne." Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. Please join me
Mr. Mayor, sorry, before you go on behalf of the Conservative group, can I just say a few words about Marianne Elliott?
Yes, indeed you can.
I met her for the first time in May 1978. And we were both telling, in fact, in somebody's front garden, just down the road from her home in Chinner Crescent. In those days, there was the occasional polling station, which was in somebody's front room. You weren't allowed inside if you were telling. And so when it started to rain, we gathered together in the porch to get a little bit of shelter. And we got chatting. And I think it was the first time I realised that members of the Labour Party could still be quite nice people. Up to then, I hadn't realised that. Anyway, we kept on our paths crossing over the years, and she always was very genial. Her time as an alderman was before even my time on the council. It was a very long time ago. And so I can't make any comment on that, but I can say that she'll be sorely missed.
Any more? So I don't. Okay, thank you very much all. Please join me in 1 minute silence for Diana Bagan and Marianne Elliott.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Remembrance Sunday, due to the coronavirus pandemic, the traditional parade to honor Remembrance Day will not be taking place this year. A small-scale round service will be held at 3 locations across Ealing on Sunday, 8th November 2020. To ensure social distancing inside the event area, the event organizers will not be able to accommodate additional councillors, past mayors, or free men of the borough as part of the social event. Okay, next item, public petition for debate. Mr. David Castle will present the public.
Good evening.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, just before we begin, can I just, Councillor Jay Anand did declare a DPI, so can we just wait for Councillor Jay Anand to leave the meeting before we begin on this item, just to make sure that she isn't present for something she shouldn't be. She has now left the meeting. Councillor, I will call her back again and bring her back into the meeting at the end of this item. Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Mayor. I just thought it was important we clarified that.
Sure, yeah. Mr. Davis Castle will present the public petition for debate. Mr. Castle,
5 minutes
you have 5 minutes to present your petition.
Good evening. My name is David Castle. I have been an Ealing resident for the last 20 plus years, and I'm a supporter of Heathrow and the plan to expand and all the phenomenal benefits that Heathrow provides locally and to the UK. I would firstly like to thank Mr. Mayor and the Council for hearing this important petition by Ealing residents this evening. Additionally, I'd like to thank Unite the Union, GMB, and the Indian Workers Association for giving me this opportunity to address the Council tonight. Our petition that was signed by over 2,000 Ealing residents reads that, as Ealing residents, we support the Unite and GMB trade unions campaign to back Heathrow expansion, a project which benefits Ealing residents through 40,000 new jobs for the borough and around Heathrow, as well as 10,000 great new apprenticeships. We call on Ealing Council to allow a free vote on supporting expansion at the next full council meeting. Heathrow is currently the UK's largest single site employer, with 76,000 people working at the airport and a further 114,000 people in the local area. Expansion will create a further 180,000 new jobs and 10,000 apprenticeships. Again, this is 40,000 new jobs for Ealing, and that does not even include the number of people commuting from Ealing to work at the airport. These will be great skilled jobs that will contribute to the local economy. Major trade unions are supporting expansion and the jobs will be created. These are not low quality, 0-hour contracts. In fact, Heathrow has committed to stamp out 0-hour contracts entirely from the airport. Councillor Bell on Crossrail has previously made reference to the east-west income divide in the borough of Ealing. Expanding Heathrow is the best way to deliver change in terms of social mobility and diversity in the borough. There is no other project of this scale that Ealing Council could possibly support that would deliver quality jobs on that scale. And without expansion, we will see a further shift to competitor hubs in Europe, such as Paris, Charles de Gaulle, Frankfurt, Amsterdam. Right now, I am currently a year away from graduating, which I admit in the current economy is pretty daunting. Most of my friends have recently graduated and they are unemployed. Ealing is currently projected to hit 9% unemployment this year. Young people, that figure could well exceed 50% or more unemployed. And my generation and my friends in Hanwell not only support Heathrow, they very much support expanding Heathrow, as Heathrow offers an unbelievable amount of high quality jobs across all sectors, from construction, IT to retail to engineering. The list is endless. As a young person, not only is the economy extremely important for us, but so is the environment. I care passionately about the environment. Heathrow is taking great steps to address all the environmental concerns, and I'm glad that Heathrow has undertaken significant efforts and commitments to be carbon net zero by 2050. In terms of the expansion debate, Heathrow has come to the table and taken responsibility and commitment for its responsibility to the environment. The other side of the debate have admitted that even if Heathrow tomorrow was carbon net zero, they still would not support expansion. Since 2009, passenger numbers are up 25% and emissions are down 3%. Technology is changing rapidly, and so is sustainable net zero goods, which are now a £1 trillion industry. Innovation and the future on the side that we can both have great jobs and a great green environment. Recently, we've heard a lot about COVID. Here's a reminder, despite COVID, Heathrow is a national strategic asset for the UK. Heathrow is vital for the UK's economy, and residents are proud to host the airport. Ealing has a deep history with the airport. Ealing's history and its diversity are inseparable from the airport. And Ealing's residents are not pessimistic. The UK's aviation sector is coming back and it'll be bigger than it's ever been before. And not only that, it will be greener than it's ever been before, as older aircraft are being phased out with new, greener, sustainable aircraft being delivered right now. Delaying expansion means delaying investment, delaying jobs, delaying economic growth, which will provide for the UK to become greener. Ealing and the West London area needs urgent action to support young people and the local economy. From the council's own resident survey, you will know that over 69% of residents support Heathrow expansion. The only way to deliver real jobs that we need right now is to support Heathrow. And Heathrow not only opens up the world's economy to the UK, it opens up Ealing to the world and all that comes with it. And for that reason, I'm extremely proud to stand with Unite, GMB and the Great Indian Workers Association tonight, and backing Heathrow and all the local residents that are calling for expansion. And this is why we are asking Ealing Council to support a free vote to allow councillors to vote with their conscience and to support Heathrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have here a list. Sam, would you know, or shall I carry on?
Mr. Mayor, it's the for the portfolio holder to now respond to the petitioner. I believe it's Councillor Bell who will be.
Yes, I have that one. Yeah, okay. Okay, Councillor Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, David, for bringing this petition here tonight. Clearly, Heathrow expansion is a contentious issue, and there are lots of competing issues around Heathrow. The primary ones being the jobs argument that you've conveyed very well, and the economic contribution that Heathrow makes to our borough and the many people who work in Heathrow, and also right across West London and the Thames Valley as well. But equally counterbalancing that, there are significant issues around environmental noise, pollution, and that has led to Ealing Council having a historical position over many years now of being against Heathrow expansion, and clearly those two kind of competing issues are difficult to balance. I won't won't deny that at all. You know, we recognise the value of Heathrow for jobs, for local people. It was in fact Ealing, along with Hounslow and Slough Council, that initiated a independent report into the impact on jobs of the Prime Minister's rather bizarre estuary airport proposal when he was Mayor for London, where he sought to kind of shut Heathrow down. We commissioned that study and recognised through that study the massive contribution that Heathrow makes to our economy and to jobs. However, equally, we know that there are significant problems of noise for our residents. That will be increased by expansion with new flight paths and not only takeoffs but more landing impacts for noise on our residents. And that was why when we made our latest submission to Heathrow expansion proposals as a council, that on balance we said we were opposed to expansion. We demanded a total ban on night flights and an 8-hour ban. We also were against any change to the Western preference for takeoff as well, as that would impact more on our residents if there were more easterly takeoffs. You cannot escape the problems of noise, but there's also all of that, those issues around surface transport to the airport and the air pollution that causes to our residents as well. And we know that air pollution contributes to significant numbers of early deaths, both in London and in our borough. So, Mr. Mayor, in conclusion, I would just say that in meeting these competing challenges, Labour groups and others on this council have to make a collective decision, and we've made that collective decision within our group. I can't speak for the other groups, and we've said that we would oppose expansion. So I'm afraid we're not in a position to offer a free vote going forward. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor Millican. But let me tell you that, you know, it's 4 minutes each.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I'd like to thank Mr. Castle for bringing this important subject to the council for our consultation, for our consideration this evening. So thank you very much. I have to say the motion is specifically asking for a new debate with a free vote. That's what the motion is for. And so whilst we can all see the huge value of Heathrow Airport as a gateway to the world, and frankly, and the jobs it supports, exactly as Mr. Castle says, I'm sure we all know people who work at the airport, and many people, probably many in this meeting today, travel through the airport probably once a year or whatever, on business or holidays or whatever. So we're all very familiar with the airport. But frankly, I'd be fair to say that most Conservatives in the borough are against further expansion of the airport, because many of the points I would echo that Councillor Bell has just said, because of the environmental impacts, the noise, the pollution, and so on. And we all know that there's actually more pollution, as I understand it, from the vehicles travelling to and from the airport than there is from the planes themselves, as I understand it. However, as our group, I am happy to support this petition. You're asking for a new vote and you're asking for a free vote. But as I've said, most Conservatives would be against this for the reasons we've said, but we would be happy to have a new vote and have it not whipped. So again, Mr. Mayor, I'd like to thank Mr. Castle for presenting this, and I don't particularly wish to contradict Councillor Bell too much on this, but I have to say we would vote in favour of this motion this evening.
Councillor Steed.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. I hope you can hear me. I don't really wish to take more than anything like the 4 minutes that I've been allocated. Really just to reiterate the comments from the Leader of the Council and also from David Milliken. Firstly, thanks to David Castle for coming to full council. He very eloquently put forward the role and the contribution that the airport makes to the borough, and indeed, as has been said before, to the greater West London area. However, I do find it rather strange that at this particular time, Mr. Castle and the various groups that he represents comes to the council at this time, bearing in mind some of the statistics that are that affect Heathrow at the moment. My understanding is that there are 82% fewer passengers going through Heathrow at the moment, and that the airport is making a loss of £5 million a day. Senior staff have been reduced by a third, I believe, and one has to question, surely, the plans, the current plans for expansion, and whether they really do still hold a realistic chance of ever actually happening. One other statistic, I could throw into the debate. A recent poll indicated that 80% of residents felt positive about the reduction in flights that they are currently witnessing. So on that basis, and again on the arguments that have already been made by council colleagues representing the Liberal Democrat group, I find it very hard that we can support this particular petition. Nice as it seems to have the option of having a free vote, and we maintain our opposition to the further expansion of Heathrow Airport. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kelly.
Thank you very much. Twice in one night, feast or famine. Can I add my thanks to Mr. Castle for bringing this petition to our attention, because they raise very important questions about jobs and the local economy, both of which are closely tied to London Heathrow Airport. In my own ward in Greenford and in my road where people live, and in neighbouring areas such as Northolt, Southall and Central Ealing as well, and the businesses that are linked to it, Heathrow and the business linked to it are very significant employers, and the loss of them will be devastating locally. Given the global and unprecedented crisis faced by the aviation industry, the question of expansion does feel like putting the cart before the horse. But the priority of this council is to work with Heathrow, the neighbouring boroughs and the government. And we need to secure the aviation sector's jobs we already have, many of which are hanging by a thread. We know that the Borough of Ealing has one of the highest percentages of its workforce using the furlough scheme of any country. And the key reason for them to be remaining in furlough is because they work in aviation. With the furlough scheme winding down, with no sign of rebound for air travel in the coming months, we are entering the danger zone for thousands of jobs locally. As a council, we are prioritising our skills and employment work to help those at risk, and alongside other West London boroughs, we continue to lobby the government hard to come forward with an urgently tailored package for support of the aviation communities. We are clear, a thriving, world-leading airport at Heathrow is vital. That's why we strongly oppose, like was said by Councillor Bell, the previous Mayor and current Prime Minister's harebrained scheme to close Heathrow and move it to the Thames estuary. When it comes to plans for expansion, everybody knows that it's difficult. Everyone wants good jobs and investment for thousands of residents, but nobody does want increased pollution for thousands of residents. That's why Ealing Labour has always been clear what our position is, and it has been set out in our manifesto in 2018. Any decision by the government to go forward with expansion must be based on minimising air and noise pollution for Ealing residents. We have always asked for a substantial package of mitigation and compensation. Include substantially increased noise insulation for homes, schools and businesses, improved transport facilities for passengers and employees. So Councillor Millican talked about the travel to and from the airport. We will demand that we have improved noise pollution for that element as well. It's not about the airport, it's about getting in and out of the airport. We understand that in the Labour group. We want to prevent congestion on our roads and we want to have more public transport.
30 seconds.
We're also very key elements of Heathrow expansion is apprenticeships and skills opportunities for our local young people. And those offers have not been on the table. They simply have not materialised. The future shape of aviation is unclear and the ball is firmly in the court of government when it comes to airport expansion. And we'll keep demanding support for our aviation communities in this crisis and work constructively to ensure that there's a thriving future for Heathrow Airport. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bell, to sum up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I'll be very brief. Yeah, I think what Councillor Kelly's just said in terms of the recovery for the aviation industry and Heathrow, particularly from COVID, is where our efforts and attention is right now, and that's clearly the most important thing. Also, I'd add that the courts have yet to decide on Heathrow's appeal against the initial court decision to halt expansion for environmental reasons. So that is still undetermined and with the courts. So what I'd say in conclusion is that you know, we as the Labour group, as the majority group, will maintain our position as Councillor Kelly's read out from our 2018 manifesto, and that we would not agree to a free vote on Heathrow expansion at the next council meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I might need a guidance here, Sam. This is the end of that item. Am I correct?
Yes, you're correct, Mr. Mayor. So we can move on to petition. If you wanted to thank Mr. Castle, obviously, but move on to the petitions if there are any.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Castle. Okay, petitions from members of the council. Do any member have a petition they wish to present? Okay, now we move to the next item. Questions from members of the public, you know.
There are no questions from members of the public, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. Item 10, questions from members of the council. We now move on to questions, you know, from members of the council. For those members who want to ask second supplementary questions, can they indicate in the chat box once the original question has been asked? Okay. Okay, Councillor Young to Councillor Mahfouz.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Does the portfolio holder agree with the Conservative group that Ealing's share of the £63 million Welfare Assistance Fund should be spent on the provision of free school meals during the school holidays for children of low-income families?
Firstly, thank you very much, Councillor Young, for your question. And Mr. Mayor, if we were sitting in the chamber, you'd very easily see that this is a Labour council. So, of course, we are putting measures in place to ensure that no child in Ealing goes hungry this half term. In fact, it was Councillor Young's colleagues in Westminster who voted not to provide the funding for this, leaving councils like ours to step in once again, despite our funds being decimated by a decade of austerity under this Tory government.
Shame, shame.
We were indeed allocated £396,000 from that one-off emergency assistance grant for food and essential supplies. And I'm not sure if Councillor Young believes that we put it away in a savings account or something, but I'm afraid I've got to break it to him. This funding was actually allocated to support Ealing residents some months ago, and we're now faced with significant financial pressures as a result of the pandemic. So, Mr. Mayor, we can't use this funding for free school meals, and indeed the government didn't ever tell councils that we should use it for that purpose when the grant was issued. In fact, Mr. Mayor, government guidance said that the government anticipated that most of the funding would be spent within 12 weeks. So I can only assume that memo didn't get circulated to the local Ealing Tories. However, Mr. Mayor, the council, I'm proud to say, has still committed funds to support the provision of free school meals to those who need it. Residents can contact the council, and we will ensure that each child eligible for free school meals during term time will receive the support they need, either through Ealing's Food Bank or through a voucher to spend in local supermarkets. Each child who is eligible will receive either support through that food bank or a £15 voucher of food support for half term. The same amount, Mr. Mayor, as that denied to them by Tory MPs only a few days ago. We have committed a minimum of £50,000 up front to support Ealing's Food Bank, and we are making sure that we can deal with the demand by having e-vouchers in place. In addition to that, regardless of the costs, Mr. Mayor, Ealing Council will fund this essential spend. Meanwhile, London is in tier 2 with COVID-19 cases rising, and the Chancellor still hasn't come clean on the phantom funding formula he's using to determine funding for areas under tier 3 restrictions. Given that they've tabled this question tonight, I suspect the Ealing Tories have taken the same statistics course as Rishi Sunak. We need clear, consistent and fair funding for councils. After a decade of austerity, we won't be able to step in every time this Tory government makes another woeful decision. Our message hasn't changed. We need the Tories to pay their bills. Your friends, Councillor Young, those in Westminster, some of those who sat on the same benches as you only a few months ago, promised to refund the cost of the COVID-19 response, and they haven't done it. I'm inviting you and your colleagues again, join us, join our campaign to make sure that funding for Ealing Council that was promised is delivered. We're facing a second wave of COVID-19 and a very difficult recovery. We can't do that on the cheap. Mr. Mayor, the government must keep its promise and it must pay its bill.
Thank you very much, Councillor Young. Do you have any supplementary question?
Yes, supplementary,
Mr. Mayor, before we move on, can you confirm that Councillor Jasbir Anand has rejoined the meeting, please?
Okay, they all heard you.
Mr. Mayor, I have, and Deputy Mayor, I have joined the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Councillor Young.
Supplementary, Mr. Mayor. Would the portfolio holder thank the government for creating the £63 million Local Welfare Assistance Fund so that councils can help those who are struggling to get hold of food and essentials? Also, for them increasing universal credit by over £1,000 per year. Also, for them increasing the local housing allowance, providing 180 million for discretionary housing payments to help people with their rent, as well as providing £16 million for food charities. I really thank the government for all of that.
Councillor Young, I think, you know, this is absolutely very telling. You don't need me or anybody else in this chamber to be thanking the government. It'll be very telling when those people out there, the people on the front line, if you actually spoke to real people who are facing the harsh reality of COVID-19 day in, day out, the absolute concern, not only for those people in terms of their health, but also the economic fortune or misfortune that is potentially on the cards for them, because this government is happy to spend millions on certain things, and then when it comes to actually the pivotal stuff, like making sure that those children over this half term don't go hungry, they turn their cheek and look the other way. And I don't think anybody in this country is going to thank them for that.
Thank you very much, Councillor Mahfouz. Does anyone have a second supplementary question? I will now go to the chat box.
So I have got a supplementary question, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, carry on.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Does the portfolio holder know how much it would have cost for the Tory to provide free school meal nationally this half term?
Thank you, Councillor Mahmood. A very, very pertinent question. So really appreciate that, and obviously one that I'm sure Councillor Young may be aware of. Who knows? But it's been reported that it would cost £150 million to ensure that children don't go hungry nationwide this half term, had the government had the guts to make that decision last week. Now that might sound like a lot of money, but let me put that into a bit of context, because in 2019 the Tories spent £13.8 million on a government ferry contract with a company that had, remember this, no boats. But that was nothing compared to this year. So let me just give you a couple of examples. The government spent 130 million, so almost the same amount, with a Conservative donor for testing kits for COVID-19 that were unsafe to use. They also spent the same amount, 150 million pounds, for face masks that, guess what, couldn't be used by NHS staff because they didn't meet the regulations. So we have to ask ourselves why the government is able to find millions to spend on useless PPE and not find the same amount of money to feed our children. Put simply, it's about political priorities. For the government, feeding children over half term was not a priority. They think it's not their problem because it doesn't affect them. And as difficult as it is for me as a Liverpool fan to praise a Manchester United player, I've got to say Marcus Rashford has played an absolute blinder with his phenomenal campaign, and the outpouring of support up and down this country for his campaign has made it abundantly clear that the rest of the country thinks it should be far further up the to-do list of this government. And Mr. Mayor, it's a very simple message for this government. No child should go hungry. Pay the bill.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Councillor Raza to Councillor Sepie.
Could the Cabinet member please help set the record straight on Transport for London of the funding and the control, and the Tory government's attempts to disguise plans to downgrade and take over London's transport system?
Thank you, Councillor Raza. I am very happy to, particularly as the misinformation spread by the Tories about Transport for London has been staggering. London's the only major city in the world that receives no government funding to run its public transport service. Transport for London is struggling financially because Londoners did the right thing. They stayed home during the spread of COVID-19. That was so they could save lives, dramatically reducing the fares that TfL has got. Our reward has been for the Tory government to take political advantage of this situation by offering a disgraceful deal to keep TfL running. The proposed deal hits Londoners with a triple whammy of more expensive transport transport fares, higher council tax bills, and millions of more Londoners having to pay the congestion charge. That's punishing Londoners for doing the right thing on COVID-19 by staying at home. London's economic recovery relies on stable public transport, but while the government gave failing private train operators an 18-month blank cheque so they can continue to run at a profit, they continue to punish us Londoners. Residents all over London, including across the whole of Ealing, are facing fare hikes and the scrapping of free travel and concessions for children and older people. This will hit the vulnerable the hardest. And Boris Johnson has incredibly claimed that Sadiq bankrupted TfL. He said this in Parliament. It's a barefaced lie. Boris Johnson left TfL with a 1.5 billion deficit. 1.5 billion. Sadiq has reduced that by 71%. When he was mayor, Boris Johnson entered into an agreement with George Osborne, whatever happened to him, to cut TfL's annual 700 million operating subsidy. Operating costs were also growing every year before Sadiq became mayor. Sadiq has put a stop to all of that. Boris Johnson, I'm sorry to say, was a useless Tory mayor who defunded London's transport system, not defended it. The best thing we can do for Ealing is to get Sadiq back into office as our Labour mayor next year to fight for Londoners and stop Boris Johnson from finishing the job of bankrupting TfL. It's that simple.
Thank you very much. Councillor Raza, do you have a supplementary question?
Yes, I do. Why does the cabinet member believe that the Tory government are so obsessed with undermining our Mayor of London?
Well, I think that's also quite simple, Councillor Raza. It's because they don't want people to make the comparison between the now Prime Minister Boris Johnson and our Labour Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. Sadiq's more than 20% ahead in the polls for a reason. While the Tories have confused the nation with their constant announcements of different restrictions and their inability to establish a functioning test and trace system, Sadiq has given clear advice from the start and demanded action from this government, defending Londoners and promoting Londoners. And he's argued for extending furlough and supporting freelancers just as two key examples. The Tories have done nothing to help the thousands of families stuck in substandard private accommodation. Sadiq was lobbying for rent controls to give those families a stable home. Last year, London started to build more council homes than in any other year since 1984 and doubled the funding to help rough sleepers. The Tories are trying to deflect from their own poor record and take advantage of COVID to defund TfL and blame it on Sadiq Khan. But sorry, Londoners aren't daft. We'll continue to support Sadiq's calls for a fair deal for TfL and to stand up for this Tory government because we're standing up for Ealing and for London. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have a second supplementary question? I'll go to the chat box. Yeah, Councillor Stafford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Is the portfolio holder aware that TfL was in financial difficulty long before coronavirus hit because of Sadiq Khan's allowing waste to grow in TfL's budget? For example, he wasted almost £50 million on service contracts, including £24 million on taxis for staff and £5 million on water coolers. The fact that Crossrail has gone from being on time and on budget to being delayed, which means that it's cost the taxpayers an extra £5 billion through overspend and loss of income. TfL has paid out nearly 20 million in golden goodbyes to departing staff. It spent 8.7 million on union facility time. It spent £1 million on luxury flights and hotels, £1 million on his car-free day PR stunt, and TfL's debt rose to the record high of 12 billion in March last year, long before the coronavirus hits. Interest payments on that debt alone is £422 million a year. Shouldn't the Mayor and this Labour Council's focus be on fixing these problems rather than petulantly blaming the government?
Thank you very much. Councillor Millican to Councillor Bell.
Do you want to let me answer that one?
Oh, yes.
Mayor?
Sorry. Yes.
I'll keep the answer short. I think Councillor Stafford's listing off a list of details that basically, once you look into them in more closeness, you'll understand are actually just not really the case of the reality of what is going on. Go back and look at what Boris did to London. Look at stuff like the Garden Bridge and the 40 million that vanished into the ether that didn't even get from one side to the other, let alone anything. It seems like Boris Johnson has the anti-Midas touch. Don't trust him with anywhere with our country, let alone with going
for 4 years. Mayor's been calm for 4 years.
I didn't speak over you, Councillor Stafford, so have some decency and have some respect to hear an answer on the situation. Don't act like a petty child. Okay, so I'm giving my answer. Let me speak it out and let me say that my point. You asked a question, you're getting a legitimate answer. You might not like the answer, but you have to listen to it. So I will make the point again. that Sadiq Khan has done fantastic things for this city in the last 4 years, and over the coronavirus crisis has made a fantastic difference in terms of actually speaking out for Londoners and fighting forward. If you do not understand that TfL has been financially impacted by coronavirus, by the fact that people aren't getting on the tube, then you really don't understand this city at all, and you have no right in terms of representing it in that context. Thank you.
May I remind everybody to come through the chair, and not actually directly ask questions, on the national time. Next question from
Mr. Mayor, I apologise. I was just so infuriated by those lies.
That's fine. That's fine. As long as we don't do it again. Councillor Milliken to Councillor Bell at last.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Bell has found the time and inclination to attend a meeting of 35 or so Hounslow residents who live on Swinkham Avenue, all aggrieved at the traffic displaced from the Northfields LTN. So when does he plan to meet representatives of the 3,000 who marched along Northfields Avenue and the 10,000, in fact more than 10,000, who've signed a petition objecting to the LTNs, so that a solution can be found to the hardship these barriers are causing?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Milliken, as you know, each experimental scheme has been introduced on the basis that it will be monitored and consulted on over 6 months before any decision is taken as to whether it should be made permanent. I attended a virtual meeting at the invitation of Hounslow councillors to listen to feedback on a very specific issue, as Councillor Milliken knows, because he was there. We've received hundreds of emails, both for and against the schemes, from Ealing residents, and have set up a transparent online platform for people to have their say and comment on issues road by road. I welcome any feedback that residents have on these schemes and want to give every opportunity for people to tell us what their experiences have been. I encourage everyone to submit these to the consultation either via email or our new commonplace platform so that your views can be taken into account.
Thank you. Councillor Milliken, do you have a supplementary question?
Yes, I do, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Bell, or Mr. Mayor, so thank Councillor Bell for his answer, but we've had the sad case of a 95-year-old lady who had the indignity of being carried some distance down the road in the rain because the ambulance couldn't negotiate the barriers to her house. We had the ludicrous situation of the fire brigade struggling to negotiate the barriers on Ensley Road. And we've had the appalling case of the police responding to a 999 call and taking ages to travel the length of Midhurst Road around the multitude of roadblocks. Now, all of these have been reported both to yourself and to council officers. So when will the emergency services be able to properly navigate these roadblocks?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Milliken. Obviously, we are in constant dialogue with the emergency services, and I know that that incident that you first referred to with the elderly 97-year-old, we are clarifying what exactly happened with the London Ambulance Service. And equally, I think, as you well know, that incident with the fire brigade, we talked with them, and that truck was not on an emergency route. It was actually going back to the station, and there was not an issue. Again, with the police, we are discussing all of these issues with our emergency service partners, and in terms of their feedback, they have said to us that they are not opposed to the LTNs. They recognise the health benefits of LTNs, and they want to work in partnership with us to make sure that where there are issues that we address them. So again, you know, I'd highlight the fact that we talked to the London Ambulance Service. They made it clear to us that they wanted APNR cameras put it in certain barriers, We listened to them. We've put those in place, and we are continuing to listen. And the London Ambulance Service have said very clearly that our kind of model of engagement and responding to them is a model for other boroughs to follow. Equally, although there have been some increases in attendance times that the London Ambulance Service Chair talked about earlier, they have not impacted on the safety of their patients, and they have continued to be able to do their fantastic work of keeping our residents safe. And that keeping our residents safe is our #1 priority. So we'll continue to work with our emergency services partners to make sure that we get this right.
Does anyone have a second supplementary question? Chat box.
Yes, Councillor Kelly.
Councillor Kelly, for the third time, carry on.
Yeah, thank you very much, Councillor, Mr. Mayor. Would the leader share details more on the various mechanisms residents now have to give their feedback on LTNs, and what our next steps are and trials for the trialling of LTNs?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Kelly. Individual schemes will shortly have an interim assessment to look at the feedback from residents and businesses, and that will be and that feedback will have come via email and also through the council's LTN project on the online platform Commonplace. It will also come from comments from colleagues in the emergency services, as I've just outlined, and also we'll gather feedback from ward councillors. The purpose of the interim assessment process is to check there are no significant issues that may require action or modification, and a summary report will be published in December. At the end of the 6-month period, for each low traffic neighbourhood, a final formal review will take place, and officers will look at all the available data gathered over this longer period, including air quality, traffic figures, impact on local businesses, feedback from residents, and all views expressed in the initial assessment will be updated before delivering a report to Cabinet for consideration on whether each scheme should be made permanent, modified or suspended. As each individual scheme started on different dates, they may not be considered all together, but will go to the first appropriate Cabinet meeting. Due to the postponed mayoral and GLA elections, restrictions will affect when Cabinet can consider these reports, and so it's expected that some reports will be considered after those elections. I want to reiterate and reassure residents and councillors that we do want their views, and we will listen, and what their views are will be taken into account at the point when the interim assessments take place and final decisions are made. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Next, Councillor G. Mann to Councillor J. Anand.
Yeah, Councillor Mann, you can speak. You are on now. Now again, you are muted. You are on mute. Unmute, Councillor Mann. Yeah. No, again you are muted.
What's happening?
Yeah, leave it like that and speak, please.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Many people in the Ealing are concerned about job security during the COVID pandemic, with confusion surrounding the inadequate government furlough scheme and Brexit still looming. Can the portfolio holder explain how the council is supporting local people through this difficult period?
Thank you, Councillor Mrs. Mann. I'm very concerned about the harmful impact of COVID-19 on our local economy, the welfare of our businesses and all the local people who work in those. I'm further concerned that businesses and workers across the borough will suffer more hardship as a result of the 2 restrictions we are now under. I also know that many of our communities, particularly across Southall and Northall, rely on jobs either at or linked to Heathrow Airport. This May, of the 1 in 10 jobs in the borough related to the aviation sector pre-COVID. As of August, there were over 22,000 Ealing residents on the job claimant account and over 64,000 on furlough. Noting many of those furloughed would be linked to the aviation sector. The council is working proactively with Heathrow in the following ways. Mr. Mayor, we've been collaborating with the DWP and Heathrow Academy to provide support for employees at Heathrow who are at risk of redundancy. Job Centre Plus now have their work coaches collocated with the Heathrow Academy to connect all Heathrow employees. Collaborating with DWP and Heathrow Academy on a dedicated resource to offer rapid redundancy support to employers at Heathrow. We've been working with Heathrow and Lord Blunkett on developing their local recovery plan that has 18 recommendations for recovery, mainly focused on employment, skills and supply chains. We've been further collaborating with the DWP, Heathrow Academy, Screen Skills and Pinewood Studios. Local JCPs from across the region will help identify 1,000 job seekers from the aviation industry to help transfer their skills to the film and screen industries. And for Ealing, Mr. Mayor, this can be targeted to Southall and Northall residents. Including our work with Heathrow, Mr. Mayor, the council is working on a two-pronged approach, one supporting businesses and two supporting local people who have lost their jobs. I will outline a raft of support measures under each of these, starting with business support. Circa 80 million grant has been allocated. Circa 60 million business rate reliefs has been processed. We have lobbied the Chancellor to secure additional grants for micro businesses. We're currently working through the detail of the local restriction business grant fund, which was announced by the Chancellor last week. We await confirmation for the Ealing allocation, and we will seek to distribute quickly to those businesses most in need. We have set up a dedicated business hotline and COVID-19 live site in partnership with West London businesses and neighbouring councils. We've also set up an Ealing High Street task force. We've also co-developed a High Street action plan with the bids and trade associations to support businesses across all our town centres and high streets. We will be scoping out the possibility of a business improvement district for Southall as well. We're paying close attention to all external support, including Ealing, now one of the only 3 London boroughs selected by the Mayor of London to develop a new high street state partnership and service, and we're currently preparing a 30k bid for the GPA's Resilient Fund to help with digital innovation for businesses. Mr. Mayor, moving on to supporting people who have or might lose their jobs. Council services are working closely with a wide range of partners locally in West London and at regional levels, and developing a single front door model to ensure that residents can access the full range of new and expanded employment and skills programs and funding. West London has secured 6.2 million funding to deliver the job entry and targeted support program to support around 6,000 participants. It launched on Monday, the 19th of October, so residents will be benefiting immediately. Council is acting as a broker and employer for Kickstart, delivering work placements for young people aged between 16 and 24 on universal credit. 16 local employers have already pledged 43 placements, and 11 have been pledged in the council. Mr. Mayor, despite the dramatic national reduction in apprenticeship, the council continues to increase the number of apprenticeship vacancies in the borough as part of the manifesto commitment. 622 out of the 750 vacancies have been generated in the first 2 years, plus 54 so far this financial year. A new partnership with Hawke Training will deliver a pre-apprenticeship with Hawke Training program aimed to care leavers and vulnerable young people. establishing stronger links to access additional funding. In the last 3 months, NCS have supported over 435 residents. We've been working with the Plus to build 60 new workers for Ealing. We're exploring venues for those staff and expanded services, particularly in areas for high unemployment in Southall, Northolt, and Acton. For Ealing Work, the council has virtually off services, advice, training, and access to support into employment apprenticeships and placement for young people. Mr. Mayor, I could really go on and on. We have worked very closely with our residents. If my time is up, stop there.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Jim, do you have a supplementary question?
Yes, I do. Thanks, Councillor Jasveer Anand, for your response. What portfolio holders view on the announcement from the Tory government about the future of the furlough scheme and support for business?
Thank you once again, Councillor Mrs. Mann. I'm afraid it's not very good news, and it's not good enough. Last week, we got yet another long overdue last-minute statement from the Chancellor on economic support. It's more out of time delivery for a Chancellor who is out of ideas. Mr. Mayor, the Prime Minister said people on low incomes affected by business closures would get at least 80% of their normal income through a combination of the job support scheme and universal credit. The Chancellor has done nothing to make that happen. The Chancellor has finally budgeted on this sink or swim job support scheme for businesses that are open. But the reality, Mr. Mayor, remains that many workers will still get less than 80% of pre-crisis wages because of the gaping holes in Britain's social security net. Mr. Mayor, firms that will get more support won't get it until the start of December. That's a weight many cannot afford. And new businesses support grants will come too late for many firms who've already gone under while trying to operate under restrictions without sufficient support. So the government is trying to dress up cutting support for the self-employed as giving them more, but won't wash this with those who know 40% of the pre-crisis earning is still much less than 80%. That's almost nothing for those who've been excluded from the support from the start. And both these groups are heavily affected by the gaping holes in the safety net, but the government refuses to fix. Mr. Mayor, one of our key policies as Ealing Labour is to ensure opportunity and living incomes for our communities. Overall, we need the government to be doing more and faster and ensure that things continue as anything close to normal. The council will continue to fight for the funding Ealing needs to get through and recover from COVID-19, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Does anyone have a second supplementary question? Chat box?
Yes, please, Mr. Mayor. Does the portfolio holder not recognise that the council is only able to support people due to the government providing over 40 million from the furlough scheme, protecting over 9 million jobs, 13.5 billion on the self-employed support scheme, 19 billion on the coronavirus business interruption loans, over 38 billion on the bounce back loans, 11 billion in business grants, 10 billion in business rates relief, 27 billion in VAT deferrals, supporting nearly 500,000 businesses, nearly 33 billion at the summer economic update, further billions to help local authority cash flow, and an extra 9 billion into the welfare system. Shouldn't you welcome this unprecedented level of support rather than saying you just want more?
Thank you, Councillor Young. I think sometimes you all live in cuckoo land. There are huge businesses out there who are suffering with these small pockets of grants. Businesses have closed, people's jobs have been affected, Councillor Young. You're talking about billions, which is across the country. Speak about Ealing. Let's talk about Ealing. Let's see what Ealing has got out of this. We are suffering, micro businesses, small business are suffering at the hands of these petty grants. We're getting announcements left, right and centre, but there isn't enough support to keep these businesses afloat. I think you need to understand that we are in a crisis. We are facing a juggernaut coming towards us where the jobs are being lost. Heathrow is being affected. There's a supply chain that's being affected, Councillor Young. You need to wake up and lobby for these businesses and lobby for these residents who are vulnerable at the hands of your government. We can move on to talk about the support that the council is giving. Our council services are working closely with a wide range of partners locally in West London and regional level, and developing a single front door model to ensure that residents can access the full range of our new and expanded employment skills programs and funding. Mr. Mayor, I'll rest my case there. I think Councillor Young needs to really wake up and look at the crisis around him.
Thank you very much, Councillor Coomer. To Councillor Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can the leader confirm whether Historic England was in favour of or highly critical of the 26-storey redevelopment plans for Percival House?
Mr. Mayor, Councillor Kumar, Vistry and the council have been engaging with Historic England about the redevelopment of the Percival House site for some time. Historic England were consulted during the pre-application process for the development. Historic England have not raised objections, nor are they highly critical as suggested by your question. In this context, Historic England's role is to consider the impact of new development on surrounding heritage assets, including buildings, conservation areas and views. We received Historic England's consultation response letter of the 5th of October, which says Historic England has concerns regarding the proposals, particularly in relation to the impact of the proposed tall building on the setting of nearby heritage assets.
Peter Mason was going to
Historic England has identified the following locations where it considers harm would arise. A view of the listed Christ the Saviour Church, Ealing Town Hall and Ealing Town Conservation Area. The harm could be mitigated by an unspecified reduction in height and or removal of red terracotta feature facing material. Secondly, B Walpole Park, including listed bridge and Ealing Green Conservation Area. The harm could be mitigated by an unspecified reduction in height. The harm caused by the tower to heritage assets is characterised by Historic England as less than substantial. That is an important and lesser hurdle than substantial harm, where development should only be contemplated in exceptional or wholly exceptional circumstances. Less than substantial harm can be mitigated or balanced by firstly the applicant demonstrating to the council's satisfaction that feasible alternatives to a tall building have been explored, and secondly the public benefits, e.g. new housing, especially affordable housing, new jobs, training and apprenticeships, new civic offices, public realm and civic space enhancing the setting of the listed town hall satisfactorily outweigh the harm. The mitigating balancing exercise is carried out by the local authority in determining the planning application. That process includes, as requested by Historic England, analysis of relevant national planning policy framework and development plan policy. Further work will continue engaging with heritage experts and the applicant's architects to investigate ways in which the Historic England design concerns on visual impact can be addressed.
Thank you, Councillor Pell. Councillor Kumar, do you have a supplementary question?
Yes, I do, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. How will the council reconcile the scathing comments from Historic England with the reported statement from the developers on Ealing today that reduction in the height or the density of the scheme is not possible given the council's demands?
So, Mr. Mayor, I think I've already answered that question. You know, the Historic England comments were not scathing, and I've said that they've said that the harm is less than substantial, and that there are mitigating impacts that can be carried out, which don't necessarily talk about reduction in height. But I'll leave it at that point, Mr. Mayor.
Does anyone have a second supplementary question? Chat box.
Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
We need to move on to the motion. It's 8:30, so we have to move on to the motion. So shall we get advice from Sam? Shall we move?
I think so, yes, indeed, because
yes, once
Mr. Mayor, the procedure rules state that at 8:30 we must move on to the opposition motion for debate. It is 8:29, so it's up to you whether you allow the final second supplementary question, whoever wanted to ask it, or whether we move straight on to the opposition motions for debate. So I'll leave it to you, Mr. Mayor, to make a decision.
I think because of the time factor, I would just move to the second in a motion, definitely. Yeah. That's item 11. Sam?
Yeah, Sam, I think the Mayor's inviting you to confirm that Councillor Mahfouz has left the meeting.
And also, I'm just asking, you know, whether item 11 is we have to move now.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I think if you're happy, we move on to the motion, then that's fine. Sam, are you going to come in at this point and just confirm that Councillor Mahfouz has left the meeting?
Yes, Councillor Mahfouz has left the meeting. Councillor Mason is imminently rejoining the meeting. He did leave the meeting when Councillor Bell mentioned his disclosable pecuniary interest in the answer to his question, because he wasn't aware that was going to come up. So just for clarity, Councillor Mason had left the meeting just because there was a mention of his DPI. Councillor Mason is back in the meeting again now, and Councillor Mahfouz has left the meeting. So just for the public watching, all the right steps have been taken in terms of who's left the meeting and who's back in the meeting again now.
Yeah, I'm back. I think somebody mentioned my name.
Sorry, Sam, do you want to also mention the issue with the planning committee members at this point?
I think so, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, happy to do so. So I've been contacted by some members of the planning committee who feel that if they speak or vote on this motion tonight, they might compromise their ability to keep an open mind in relation to consideration of future planning applications relating to tall buildings. As this would not compromise a disclosable pecuniary interest, these members will remain in the room tonight but will not contribute to the debate, and their votes will be counted as abstentions. These members are Councillors Manro, Donnelly, S. Ahmed, P. Anand, Blacker, Conlon, Mahmood, Martin, Raza, Rice, Summers, Elwall, Arwall, Woodruff, Ball and Busuttil. Are there any other members who wish to be added to this list?
Okay. Thank you. I call on Councillor Stafford to move the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and I obviously move the motion in my name. And following on from that brief declaration from some members of the Planning Committee, I think it's worth me just saying that this motion is not about individual planning applications, with one exception that I will come to later on, as Planning Committee is clearly the appropriate place to discuss these things. To recuse oneself at this point is a bit like saying that members of the Planning Committee can never comment on planning policy or vote for things that they have voted on, for example, the Council's housing need requirements and other planning policy issues. So the Conservative group members do not feel that this is in any way a conflict of interest. And nor, given the Lib Dem motion, is this a wider discussion about changes to planning law or the government's current consultation, which I have stated publicly that I have some concerns with. This is about ensuring that the motion that this council passed declaring a climate change emergency and the actions in the strategy to achieve those aims for being carbon neutral by 2030 have some hope of being achieved. Now, according to the UN, 40% of all carbon emissions are caused by building and construction. And therefore, we as a council need to commit to doing everything we can to encourage environmentally friendly construction in our boroughs. Skyscrapers are the worst of the residential builds when it comes to carbon emissions. A recent study shows that a skyscraper has more than double the carbon emissions of a 10-story building of the same floor area. And in Ealing, we have 50 planned building sites that are above 10 stories. So this should concern us greatly. And in some ways, it's obvious why tall buildings are such an environmental villain. The steel and concrete needed in construction require vast amounts of carbon. London's soft clay bed requires deep foundations, contributing to even more steel and concrete. Much of this steel and concrete is imported, especially the steel, adding to carbon emissions. The building, by its nature being tall and thin, and therefore having a massive surface area, is very energy inefficient. And as such, they require massive heating in the winter and air conditioning in the summer, again, increasing the carbon emission. And because they are so dense, there is little or no environmental remediation, such as green open spaces or trees. But less obviously is the fact that if you create thousands of small flats in these towers and not the family homes that we need, then you're essentially creating more dormitory towns with people travelling far for work and leisure, again adding to emissions. And it's not just me saying this. Councillor Peter Mason, who up until recently was actually in charge of all of this, seems to have had a Damascene conversion. And he wrote in a tweet, "I must admit to being nervous about the growth of the number of opportunistic tall buildings being brought forward in our borough by developers." Well, Mr. Mayor, I'm sure you know there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. So we welcome Councillor Mason's sudden conversion to our cause. So this brings me finally to what the council can actually do. The first, I accept, is just words. It's to add a policy to the strategy to discourage skyscrapers. And the second is action. The council owns the Percival House site, so it can decide the height of the buildings on that land. This is not a planning matter. Whether a building meets planning law or requirements is for the planning committee. This is about a statement of intent from this council to residents and to developers saying, we will not just pay lip service to reducing climate change, but we will take decisive and immediate action. And that is why we are recommending that the council reduces the height of the Percival House building to no higher than the adjacent Dickens Yard building. Mr. Mayor, if we are going to be serious about climate change, then we need to tackle the biggest cause of that, and that is skyscraper buildings. And I urge you and all members to vote for this motion. Thank you.
Councillor Dabrowska.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I second this motion proposed by the Conservative Group leader and colleague tonight. This is one of those topics that can be debated on various tangents and over many hours. As the motion states, we're looking at the environmental impact and damage of tall buildings. Many have been built in the borough and many are waiting in the wings to be scrutinised alongside existing policy. We're here tonight to change that policy into a forward-thinking strategy. My interest and love of planning are well documented, but tonight the issue is not a planning one, rather one about the environment and the recognition that tall buildings are perhaps not as efficient as we thought once they were. Now that we are beginning to better understand the concept of embodied energy, so too must our thinking on our building structures. Various industry research articles state the building sector consumes between 30 and 40% of the primary energy in most developed countries. That is a huge percentage impacting our environment. More so, the taller the building, the more environmental cost it incurs. Those who have ever worked in construction or related industries know that building in London means huge costs. Not just the land's price tag, but also we are living on clay, meaning that any construction of any substantial size, more so skyscrapers, need very deep piling to ensure stability and prevent subsidence. So the taller it is, the deeper one has to dig. This means that the additional manufacture of concrete and or steel is needed before you even start construction above ground. Embodied energy hasn't until recently been paid as much attention as energy in use, or operational energy that is, such as the structural frame, the substructure, the upper floors, the building envelope, internal walls, the partitions, the stairs, the scaffolding, the finishes and building services. It has been noted by various industries that the environmental cost of construction of tall buildings is not only wasteful, damaging, but a far cry from being environmentally sustainable. Tall buildings are energy intense in building and energy intense in running them, which is almost the antithesis of sustainable living. In use energy consumption and carbon emissions, what is needed is to cool and heat and run lifts are typically 20% more for tall than medium height buildings. I know that Councillor Manro, for example, would make the case for people needing homes, and he is quite right. There are still too many people, over 12,000 on the council housing waiting list. However, with the council's love affair for tall buildings, with huge construction price tags, therefore impacting the property price, making affordable housing, let alone family-sized homes, less achievable. With the snowball effect of increasing neighbouring land value, this pushes this even further beyond many aspiring homeowners' reach. This is something that Councillor Manor and I have debated and fundamentally disagreed on quite frequently over the years. We all declared a climate emergency last year to be carbon neutral by 2030, yet Ealing Council is undermining yet encouraging developers who are scrambling to build rabbit hutches in the sky. Labour either believes in reducing carbon emission or not. It's that simple. You can't have it both ways. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Bell.
I think Councillor Mason wanted to come in before I spoke.
Mr. Mayor, I have an amendment, I understand, so...
Mr. Mayor, Councillor Mason want to say something.
Well, I have to actually, give this one anyway. You have there, Malcolm, so wait. The first one is Councillor Bell. I have a list.
Yeah, but Councillor Mason wants to speak, Mr. Mayor. And he came before me.
Okay, fine.
No, it's another 14-14, I'm afraid. I just wanted to say to Councillor Stafford that he really needs to be careful with his language. Whilst he might think his contribution was an innocent metaphor, Councillor Stafford knows very well that I'm a Jewish member of this council, and what he might think are casual, what he might think is a perfectly acceptable metaphor, to others will be received as a casual religious slur. So I'd ask him to please withdraw that comment now.
Mr. Mayor, I don't really know which comment I'm supposed to be withdrawing, but if I've said anything that would imply that I don't know what I said that would have caused that slur, but if I have said anything that offended Councillor Mason, then I'm happy to withdraw it.
Mr. Mayor, if Councillor Stafford needs a history lesson in the role of forced religious conversion of Jews, then I'm very happy to provide that to Councillor Stafford. He is a public official. He represents or claims to want to represent the entirety of the community in Ealing. That contains my community. And if he isn't mindful with his language, then he will cause offence, which he has done to me. So I'd like him please to withdraw that remark.
Mr. Mayor, I don't remember anything in my speech saying that anything about forced conversions of Jewish people. All I can say is I apologise to Councillor Mason if something I said implied that. I'm a massive supporter of the Jewish community who I work very closely with. So if I've said something that offended him or anybody else, I do apologise for it.
Councillor Mason, will you accept that apology?
I accept the apology, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we move on. Councillor Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can I first say that we will, as a Labour group, be voting against this motion and also the Lib Dem amendment. There are parts of the Lib Dem amendment that I think we could agree with, and I think even Councillor Stafford agreed with all of our concerns about the government's proposals regarding reforms to planning that have come forward in the planning white paper. But also I do recognise the Lib Dem amendment talks about there are instances where tall buildings are acceptable. So I'll be watching very carefully the Lib Dem members on planning when various tall buildings come forward to see whether they see any of them as being acceptable or not. One of the reasons we're voting against this motion is that it's actually quite confused. It actually links tall buildings with air quality, and I just don't understand that. So I think they've got themselves confused, the Tories. Let me just talk about sustainability and urban density. It's a complex area of policy and of academic study, and the motion refers to various studies that have been highlighted in the media of late around some of the issues that we're talking about in terms of embodied carbon in tall buildings. But I would point out that there are some of these studies are actually countered by others. So there's an Allies and Morrison study that differs from the UCL study that I think is referred to in the motion. And so, you know, what I would say is that meeting carbon reduction and broader sustainability objectives requires that we consider all impacts in the round rather than targeting individual metrics that may or may not accurately reflect environmental impacts. Well-designed density delivers benefits to the environment through resource efficiency and enhanced community. Now, clearly poorly designed density can result in strain on infrastructure and the health and social fabric of communities. But best practice guidance, including that of the UK Green Building Council, stresses the importance of whole life cycle carbon emissions. Now, I just want to say something about tall buildings in terms of their contribution to our delivery strategy as a borough for affordable housing and our affordable housing goals. Now, current government proposals suggest lifting the small sites threshold for affordable housing from schemes of 10 or more units to 50 or more, and small sites in any case are often offer poor viability for affordable housing. Now, this means that affordable housing delivery cannot be secured on smaller sites, and overall yields of affordable housing across the borough will be compromised unless the bulk of development takes place on larger sites.
Seconds.
Can I just say that Councillor Dobroska said that we had a love affair with tall buildings. Can I make it absolutely clear that both in the London plan and in the local plan, that tall buildings are exceptions, and they are not our full our complete commitment to. We realise that you know, they are the exception, and we look to deliver our affordable housing by and large on other sites. But in conclusion, Mr. Mayor, let me just say that This motion is tokenistic, it's poorly informed, and it won't result in an improved approach to either climate change or tall buildings. The council recognises the impact that all development has on climate change and intends that Ealing's climate and ecology emergency strategy and local plan will understand and address this holistically in order to ensure the greatest overall reduction in carbon emissions. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Malcolm, to move amendment. The amendment.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I stand to move the amendment in my name and making a note that myself and Councillor Steed will be voting for it, and my two fellow group members will be abstaining for the reasons I think was outlined earlier in the item, as I do think there is a risk of future planning applications being debated by people who may have said things tonight which have altered their views in the future. But in terms of tall buildings, not all small buildings are efficient from an environmental point of view. Of course, they may not be, but certainly taller ones, and some of what Councillor Stafford said is very true. The taller ones are likely to have used more raw materials to produce them, and there is a risk that they are much more damaging from an environment, as well as other negatives that residents commonly will refer to in planning committee meetings. But there are two culprits, or two reasons why there are more taller buildings in Ealing. The first one is government policy, which is very laissez-faire compared to before, and allows a lot more leeway for developers to build pretty much as high as they want when they do that. And even when the local authorities are there to measure the environmental factors and the other negatives in those developments, very clearly they haven't got the powers to do that. But secondly, and the motion does refer to this in parts, which is there needs to be a stronger local policy in place. I remember, I think it was 10 or 15 years ago now, when I was just starting off as a councillor, where I put forward as a younger councillor alterations to the planning policy in terms of the UDP, which some newer councillors may not be too aware of, and that altered certain aspects of planning policy that Ealing Council would regard when they decided whether a policy was good or not, or should be granted or refused. And I think we don't have strong enough policies in place, and some of this motion goes a little bit towards steering us in perhaps a better direction, I would say. This borough certainly does need more social and truly affordable housing, and some of the latter of that has been increased, but not enough social housing by any means, and not always in the right places. I know that many members of people in whichever community you're living or you relate to will always tell you that they were not brought into that process of a planning committee meeting or the process that leads up to there. They always feel the developer will win the day, however tall or however disagreeable those applications that are put forward. And I think one lesson the council needs to learn, maybe last week with the LTNs where there was a change of position, the council needs to be better in terms of dealing with the community and listening to the community about some of these applications, where in many cases they do seem to be very disagreeable to many members of the public. So I officially move my amendment. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor Malcolm. Councillor Steed to second the amendment.
Mr. Mayor, before we move to Councillor Steed, earlier some names of the planning committee members were announced who would like to participate in the voting. One of the names was missed, which is Councillor Cox. If that can be added to that list as well for the clarity.
Well,
yeah, that's
fine, Councillor. Hello.
Hi, Mr. Mayor. I second the Liberal Democrat amendment to the motion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Young.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This debate is not about planning, it's about climate change. It's also about hypocrisy. When the Labour speeches about low traffic neighbourhoods last week, we're all condemning the motorists for their environmental impact, but ignoring the damage this administration's policies on tall buildings are doing. The CO2 emissions from just 6 prominent tall buildings in London are equivalent to the emissions from 30,000 cars. We know that nearly 40% of global CO2 emissions are caused by buildings, whereas only 20% is due to transport, and very little of that due to cars. And it's tall buildings that are the worst offenders in this respect. Apart from the so-called embedded energy, which accounts for more than 25% of the CO2 emissions in a building's lifetime, the ongoing energy use is much greater. This is for a number of reasons. Because of the construction methods used and the logistics of tall buildings, glass is widely used. Glass is a poor insulator in winter and leads to overheating in summer, especially in south and west facing properties. This leads to requirements for air conditioning and for mechanical ventilation. That means a significant increase in a tall building's energy footprint. Even lifts in tall buildings require more energy to move the same number of people in a tall building. The estimated electricity use of a tall building is some 2.5 times greater than the equivalent 6-storey building. In short, Mr. Mayor, if we don't amend our policies, we have little chance of meeting our declared climate change targets. Reducing carbon emissions should not just be about bashing the motorists. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Johnson.
Yes, I unmuted myself. Just to say, this is a motion. Councillor Young's just telling us it's about climate change, not about tall buildings. I thought some of Councillor Stafford's remarks about skyscrapers were rather strange. I represent South Acton Ward with my colleagues, and we have a number of tall buildings, and nobody talks about skyscrapers. It sounds like something from an American film. We all know about people jumping out of skyscrapers in the 30s because of the problems with their finances and the Wall Street crash. So it's quite an emotive term. But we all know that Ealing has a shortage of land to build on. So that's one of our issues. We also know that it's expensive to buy land in Ealing. So we're trying to deliver affordable houses. We have targets which we're quite happy to try and fulfill. We've set up Broadway Living, which is going according to guidance. I must agree with some of the things that Councillor Malcolm said. He said you can have a badly designed small building which can have problems with climate. It can also be problematic. So we want well-designed buildings, tall buildings. We're not going to say that every single building should be tall. There'll be the exception rather than the rule. We will follow all the plans and rules. Councillor Young talked about tall buildings being problematic, but what it suggested is that we look at a whole life cycle carbon emissions, not just building them. So it's the whole time you've got the building up, and it will help Ealing deliver its goals of, as I said before, affordable housing. We want people to be able to have somewhere to live, and in South Acton people accept that we've got towers. I watched this morning a small amount of a programme talking about towers in Croydon. They're throughout London, and London's got to have towers to provide housing for people. And in some parts of the world, especially in America, where they have got their skyscrapers, as they call them, it's seen as quite prestigious to have a top floor flat in a tall building. So I think we need to do this. I think this motion is rather strange. It's all very muddled. We do need to do this. And as Councillor Malcolm said in his motion, which parts of we are sympathetic to, we don't know, with the possible changes that the government are suggesting, there'll be no problem at all. We could have skyscrapers or tall buildings or whatever you wanted to call them all over the place. So I think we vote against this. Tall buildings will be the exception rather than the rule, so that we can fulfil our manifesto and provide more affordable housing. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor Kumar.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Like many colleagues on this side and the other, I'm conscious of the advice provided. One of the sincerest forms of respect is to actually listen to what another has to say. This opposition motion has nothing to do with planning and everything to do with the environment. A study showed tall buildings is a phenomenon that the world is facing. Congestion of tall buildings cause an increase in air pollution in large urban areas due to wind change and direction. More and more experts are advancing the argument that embodied energy that was previously not considered in tall buildings must now be factored in the carbon emission calculations. When this is done, it is showing that tall structures are not as efficient as we first thought. Only last month, it was reported that the Gherkin, one of the earliest tall buildings to play up its environmental feature, where cooling airflow through the spiraling internal atria produces 23% carbon emissions when you factor in embodied energy. The dynamics have clearly changed. Just as new technology comes along, we must learn to embrace them. So too should be our thinking on the carbon efficiencies of our building structures. We cannot, on one hand, say we believe there is a climate emergency and pledge as a council to be carbon neutral by 2030, yet refuse to look at every aspect that will help or hinder that objective. In Ealing, we already have some of the poorest air quality in Europe. Painful as it may be to acknowledge our mortality, the future is not ours, and for many of us participating in this meeting, it belongs to our future generations. We owe it to them to ensure that we holistically look at all policies that will allow us to meet our carbon emissions target. Yesterday, the BBC reported the presence of water on the moon to sustain a lunar base, but until then, we all must share this one planet, and we must do our part. I therefore urge all members to support this motion, asking us to consider the environmental impact of tall buildings. Nothing more, nothing less. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Driscoll.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I welcome a debate in full council to consider the issue of tall buildings because it poses a complex development and management issues that many councillors have mentioned already about heating, cooling and so on. But the character of London, the character of Ealing has never remained static, and tall buildings have many issues that bring with them, whether it's visual, overshadowing, density, pressure on infrastructure, plus many other factors. So while bringing up an opportunity to debate this at full council is a precious item, it's kind of a missed opportunity. I do think this motion is confused, bringing in air quality and also the issue of tall buildings at the same time. The two things are environmentally related but have different causes, and bringing them together at the same time just adds to the confusion. It's interesting if we reflect back on Ealing's housing stock of early and mid 20th century, that has well and truly probably got embedded carbon that might have sort of paid its way. However, such construction buildings and how their constructions have severe lacking in insulation, in heating systems, in renewable heating systems, and that's where tough decisions got to be made, because that's where the majority of our residents live, in pretty standard accommodation. But that's a very difficult decision to make, and a very difficult decision and discussion to have. But this motion just avoids that difficult option, and it also avoids acknowledging the work that the council has done. The council initiated construction of passive house standard buildings that were going through the Mayor's initiative to refit programme to reduce energy consumption, the Greener Homes project and the retrofit for the future project. All those things have gone together to improve our domestic environmental footprint, but all that's just ignored in this motion. I remember in February there was a motion, a question posed by the Conservative group to the portfolio holder for housing and planning, and that had a response from the portfolio holder saying that tall buildings are a very difficult issue, focused on the land value in London, the pressure for housing, the pressure for development, and the planning system is heavily biased with regard to assessing viability where major developers are put before the public good. But that's not acknowledged in this motion. In February, that question that was put by the Conservative group also went on for the answer from the portfolio holder to explain about Tower Hamlets, Greenwich, Southwark, Newham, Croydon, all being areas of high development for tall buildings. The response from the Conservative group at the time was literally to barrack the answer. We were in the council building at the time, and the atmosphere of the meetings is very different than it is now. So much for caring about a global concern and a global climate change emergency, because that was the attitude that was given off when we were meeting in person, and that was really disappointing to see. Then we go about responsibility. I don't agree with Councillor Stafford's dismissing of national policy. We have the influence of the Secretary of State, granting permission for a 25-storey building, granting permission for a 43-storey building, and of course we've got the controversy of the Isle of Dogs development, all by the Secretary of State's grace to grant. We've also got the National Planning Framework, which according to the Centre for Sustainable Energy, removed, downgraded or watered down the requirements for a national planning criteria to do with greenhouse gases, sustainability and emissions. And that was the government's review in 2018, and it was published in 2019, the National Policy Framework, which we as a council have to abide by, and that policy overrides our policy. So no acknowledgement of that influence upon planning decisions in the borough. So that was really disappointing that that was just dismissed out of hand by Councillor Stafford. I think we've got to vote against this. This motion is confused. It doesn't acknowledge what's gone on in Ealing. It doesn't acknowledge where we are in reality. Thank you very much.
Councillor Malcolm, to sum up the amendment.
I'm happy to go straight to the votes, Mr. Mayor, if that's suitable.
Okay, fine. Councillor Stafford, will you sum up the motion?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I won't take very much time. I think people have called our motion confused, but I think it couldn't be clearer. It's trying to ensure that this council meets the target that it's set to reduce and remove and make ourselves carbon neutral by 2030. And the councillors who've spoken from the Labour and to a certain extent the Lib Dems don't seem to recognise that we will not be able to achieve that if we don't have policies on the environmental standards of our buildings. And I dispute Councillor Bell's view that tall buildings are no less environmentally impactful than others, when all the studies do show that they are. I also dispute his phrase that tall buildings are the exception. There are 50 sites across the borough where tall buildings above 10 stories are being built. So they're not the exception, they're becoming the norm. And I think unless this council takes a grip of this issue, then we will be seeing a blight of tall buildings and therefore an inability to meet our 2030 climate change emergency commitments that we made some months ago in this council. So I urge people to vote for this motion so that we can address the climate change impact on our borough. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I will now ask the whips, from the parties to indicate their parties' votes on the amendment. Councillor Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The Labour group will be voting against the amendment.
Does anyone wish to vote differently to the indication of their whip? No.
The planning, Mr. Mayor, I'm part of the planning committee. I will be abstaining from the vote.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, on behalf of the planning committee members, we will be abstaining. So we've already indicated that.
I'm talking to the whip, so you must be coming under any one of them. So
Mr. Mayor, for clarification, we've agreed that the Labour members of the planning committee are abstaining on this motion.
but the rest are supporting the whip.
Correct.
Okay, fine. Councillor Milliken, how will the Conservative group vote on the amendment?
Mr. Mayor, it's Councillor Stafford here. The Conservative group will be voting against the Lib Dem amendment.
Does anyone wish to vote differently to the indication of their whip? Okay, Councillor Paul, how will the Lib Dem group vote on the amendment?
Thank you. Councillor Busuttil and I will abstain for the reasons that have already been discussed about planning councillors. The rest of us will be voting for the amendment.
Does anyone wish to vote differently to the indication of their whip? The amendment therefore falls. I will now move on to the vote of the motion. On the motion, Councillor Gordon, how will the Labour group vote on the motion?
The Labour group will be voting against the motion, and the members of the planning committee will be abstaining.
Does anyone wish to vote differently to the indication of their whip? Okay, Councillor Milliken, how will the Conservative group vote on the motion?
Once again, Mr. Mayor, it's Councillor Stafford. The Conservative group will vote in favour of the motion.
Does anyone wish to vote differently to the indication therewith? Councillor Ball, how will the Liberal Democratic group vote on the motion?
Again, Councillor Busuttil and I will abstain on the motion. The rest of us will vote for the motion.
Does anyone wish to vote differently to the indication of their whip? The motion is therefore false. Okay. Now we're going to other motions for debate. Before the debate begins on this item, can my clerk confirm that Councillor Mahfouz has rejoined the meeting and Councillor Rooney has left the meeting?
I'm just waiting to see that Councillor Rooney's left the meeting, and I'll confirm that once I see it appear. And I've Councillor Rooney has now left the meeting, and Councillor Mahfouz is back in the meeting.
Okay, fine. I call on Councillor Rai to move the motion.
Mr. Mayor, I propose this motion. Mr. Mayor, we were promised a world-beating test, track and trace system by the Tory government, and instead it delivered catastrophic series of blunders, including 3 data breaches. And only this month, a glitch in the system stopped 16,000 cases being reported, which would have meant that for potentially at least a couple of days, thousands of people may not have been told to self-isolate, and the infection would have continued to seed its way through communities. The launch of Test and Trace on May the 28th saw 25,000 contact tracers being appointed. Let's not forget, minus the problematic app. All the contact tracers had to do was to identify people who had been in close contact with someone testing positive for COVID-19 and advise them to self-isolate. Matt Hancock announced that tests would be available for anyone with symptoms. What we needed at this stage was a precise response, as was demanded by this pandemic, and at that point we also had time to curb it before the second wave. For example, at the end of the full lockdown, the incidence of COVID-19 cases in Ealing was low, and now we've one of the highest in London, with more than 500 cases a week and an infection rate of 207.4 per 100,000 of the population. We've all been put at greater risk because this government took the wrong approach with its push for privatisation, resulting in billion-pound contracts for the outsourcing giants Serco and Citel to deliver Test and Trace. In my view, they were foolish to set it up in parallel to our public health experts and NHS services who have the necessary expertise to deliver contact tracing. It's been an unmitigated disaster for which we're all paying a hefty price through the Tories' negligent use of taxpayers' money to deliver trading profits in excess of 160 million for Serco alone. But more crucially, we're all paying a price through the exposure of thousands of people to the virus and loss of life, much of which I believe could have been prevented. And Mr. Mayor, this is not surprising when you look at who runs Test and Trace, with representation from businesses, Jaguar, Waitrose, TalkTalk and TravelX, with just one epidemiologist. I can't see the added value here. The focus seems to be purely business. Mr. Mayor, it baffles me as to how Test and Trace can fall below the government's own targets to deliver a safe public health response and get away with it. According to the government's own SAGE committee, 80% of all contacts of symptomatic COVID-19 cases need to be found and communicated with, and yet NHS Test and Trace only managed to hit 62.6% last week, while public health teams hit 97.7% with more complex cases that are passed down to them. How did this national theatre translate for Ealing residents? Many were unable to book a testing slot, and if they were successful, it was some distance from home. The government also imposed restrictions on our local testing sites, which meant people in Ealing were denied the full number of testing slots for each day. Although this has now been largely resolved, there are still issues with turnaround times for test results. Just 15.1% of people who were tested for COVID-19 in England for week ending October the 14th with the so-called in-person tests received their results within 24 hours. This is the lowest weekly percentage since the system was launched and is down 32.8% from the week before. So after an 8-month cocktail of indecisiveness, confusion and failure, this government now turns to local councils for help under the guise of local contact tracing partnerships. We're now developing local tracing systems to support the national failing system. Let there be no mistake that our local system, which starts next week, is being implemented for the good of our residents and not to bail out this government, which has failed the people of this country. It has no vision. It has no credible strategy for Test and Trace. It's therefore not surprising that Test and Trace continues to play out in such a haphazard way nationally.
30 seconds.
And yes, where the national system failed in reaching residents testing positive, we will continue with attempts to reach them. We'll do this through a combination of calls as well as hand-drop personalised letters. We'll support self-isolation. Mr. Mayor, it's far too late to undo this government's mess, but the key priority going forward has to be the health and well-being of the people of this country. Instead, this government's focus is wrong in my view. This government is out of its depth in addressing this pandemic, and if I were the opposition, I'd ask for the resignation of its Prime Minister, the Health Secretary and Baroness Dido Harding and her board. I'd ask for their resignation because they've all failed the people of Ealing and the people of this country during this pandemic. Mr. Mayor, I ask members of this council to support this Labour motion on Test and Trace. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Bell, seconder of the motion.
Yeah, I'm seconding it, but I'm not going to speak, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Stafford to request amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and I propose the amendment in my name. I think there's actually a lot in the Labour motion that we can agree with, and you will see from our amendment we have kept the vast majority of the amendment of the motion there. I don't think anyone is disputing there have been significant problems with Test and Trace, and that those problems need to be resolved rapidly. And indeed, I don't think anyone disputes the fact, the role for a local Test and Trace service. And I do agree with Councillor Rye that we have local expertise that would definitely help and indeed build upon any national expertise. But it's not all doom and gloom, as Councillor Wright seems to be suggesting. I mean, from having a capacity to test about 2,000 people a day in March, the government has managed to build the largest diagnostic network in British history. You know, one of the best testing rates in the world, outpacing places like Germany, Spain, and Italy. And we have at the moment, I think about a week ago, the capacity to test 340,000 tests a day. and this is doubled over the summer. And there's an ambition to try and get it up to 500,000 tests in the next couple of weeks. I think we've talked about care homes earlier on. Over 10 million testing kits have been delivered to 14,000 care homes. So there is a real danger here that Labour is going to be seen to be playing politics on test and trace. You know, test and trace plays a vital role in our fight against coronavirus. And it's not, as I've said, a question of national versus local, but rather both working together to control and suppress the spread of the virus. I think as the government improves the system further, Labour should set aside this kind of political opportunism and get behind the national effort for the virus. You know, when the government has provided £300 million to help local authorities set up local test and trace services, I think it's a little rich from Councillor Rye to say the government's done nothing. You know, on the 22nd of May, months before Labour started calling for more local involvement, that £300 million was given to local authorities to help with their local test and trace. And furthermore, Labour seems to be criticising the private labs that are involved in the testing, but they seem to have no proposals as how those tests would be done if we didn't use the private sector. This is an ideological demonisation of the private sector, and it's not going to achieve anything except deprive the country of the vast majority of its testing capacity, meaning it would be harder for people who need a test to get one. So, you know, we support a national and local element of test and trace in order to ensure that the people of Ealing and indeed the people of the country get the best service and ensure that those people who have got coronavirus can be found, their close contacts can be notified, and those appropriate people can be self-isolated or isolated depending on the situation. So I asked Labour to accept our amendment to take out the hyperbole about the government. Let us all work together locally to ensure that there is enough money from central government to ensure that we have an appropriate local test and trace service, and that we as political parties across the borough show a united front to the residents of this borough, that we stand with them to provide the best test and trace service that this borough can provide. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Young.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I wish to second the motion. I also want to take issue with something that Councillor Rye said. I was surprised. I've heard so much about what is wrong with the test and trace system. When I researched this speech today, I was amazed at how much is being done. In fact, it's 80% the figure in the last week that we've got figures available for, which is the 8th of October to the 14th of October, not the 5th of October as it says in the motion. 80% were reached. I thought that was pretty good, but then I looked at what the definition of being reached was. The definition of being reached in England is that you've not only been contacted, but you have responded and you've given in contacts. So if you were contacted and had travelled on a bus and didn't know anybody else you were travelling with, you couldn't give those contacts. That would count as not being reached. There's 1.5% who gave no details, so they couldn't be reached. But of the others, if you didn't give a response or you wouldn't give a response, then your count as not being reached. Now, the difference with, say, Scotland is that they count as reached if you send them an SMS text. You don't have to have a response from the person who's being contacted. And their figures, they've done 90,000 since May. In England, we did nearly 100,000 last week. That's a massive, massive undertaking. And that gave rise to over 250,000 contacts. And 75% of those were successfully contacted. Now, how many people you met in the last week would you know their details and be able to pass them on? I think that's a fantastic figure. Our testing capacity is now over 3 million tests a week. As Councillor Stafford said, it was just down to 2,000 in March. That's a massive increase again, far more than we thought we would ever do when we started this process. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do. Mr. Mayor, you've worked in a laboratory. You know how difficult it is to make sure that standards don't slip. PCR tests, polymerase chain reaction tests, are particularly sensitive to mistakes. Even the slightest bit of contamination, you'll get a false result because the way that it multiplies and magnifies the DNA Even just one molecule is one too many. It will ruin the test. And the conditions have to be right. The materials that are doing the test have to be available, and the staff has to be available. Now, one of the problems in recent months has been that university lecturers have been working part-time in the laboratories to make up a bit more money. They've gone back to teaching the students, so that has reduced the workforce. But even so, we've managed to increase the number of tests by 33% since September. That's a pretty amazing result if you think about it. The scale of this thing is like setting up Tesco's from scratch. If you can imagine that, well, that's why you need the businessman on your side. So, Mr. Mayor, it could be better. At the moment, if you can't contact somebody in 24 hours, they can pass it on to the local authority. And I think that's a useful thing to do, because then local knowledge can come into play. So I would like to see some greater involvement of the local authority. But it's a pretty good effort they've done so far. Don't knock it. You couldn't have done any better.
30 seconds.
Thanks, Councillor Young. Can I call Councillor Basitil?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. We all know that the impact on our community has been severe. Of course, most devastating for the families and loved ones of those who have been taken by the disease, but also the consequences of a period of lockdown and continued uncertainty on health and well-being of our community, particularly those people who have already vulnerable and struggling with health and loneliness. It's also been devastating for our local economy and the economy as the nation as a whole. The British government's response to the whole pandemic has been characterised as too late, too little, and too confused again and again. From PPE supply to testing, from people falling through the cracks for financial support, to shameful neglect of care homes patients. From confusing advice about reopening schools and now shambolic and expensive test and trace implementation. Time and again, this crisis has tested this government, and time again it has failed to step up to the challenge. Unison branded the current test and trace system a mess. We all hoped 3 months ago that a second wave wouldn't happen, and here we are 3 months on, and cases are on the rise again. Only this evening, the Evening Standard has reported a further 732 new cases of coronavirus over this last week here in Ealing. It has been reported time and time again that effective test and trace systems will be instrumental in preventing a second wave and further harsh lockdowns. With local spikes in infection rates and local lockdowns, councils are taking matters into their own hands to ensure residents are contacted. With many councils developing their own test and trace systems, The Guardian said in an article a few weeks ago, it said in such a global crisis, much of the response has been local. The newspaper also recommended it is essential that national government recognises the enormous role of communities are playing and should resource and empower them accordingly. But I'm going to end on by saying this, Mr. Mayor. Despite the inadequacies of the national government, we would remind ourselves the tremendous efforts of members of the community and voluntary sector, council members of all parties working hard within their wards to support local people, and of course our own council employees delivering key services and supporting local people within the community. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Berg.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, before Councillor Burke speaks, can I make a request that we lift the guillotine, please? I put a message in the chat. I believe that the Labour group will support that.
Can we check the chat box? Are they agreed?
Mr. Mayor, if the Labour, it's Paul Nysaric, if the Labour group are supportive of lifting the guillotine, then we can add, if you choose, Mr. Mayor, we can add a further half an hour to 10 o'clock and proceed with the speeches before we go to the vote on this motion and all the other items, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Okay, just go on then, Councillor Burke.
Okay, thank you. I'm asking you to support this motion. We've just heard that this might be a bit of an exaggeration, but actually, really what we should focus on is not the 60% of people that have been reached, but the 40% of people who haven't been reached. And if you think about all those people and all the people you met during the last week, and if you were a teenager, all the people that you met in the last week, it's absolutely no surprise that the spread of the disease is as it is. And actually, there was a question there, I'm changing my speech as you probably gathered, there was a question there about could we do any better? I'm certain in my role in healthcare, if I had had 6 months to create something for safety, and this is what I'd achieved, I don't think I would still be in my role. I think I would have been well removed from my role. The system has failed. The procurement was deeply flawed. Serco has a history of failed projects. It monitors its own contract and sets its own terms. There's been no transparency. There's been very little published about how these contracts have worked. I really feel for the contact tracers. I'm sure they're all really trying to work hard at this, but their training has been really poor. They lack clinical expertise and they lack clinical supervision. There's evidence of multiple calls to one household and none to others. And as for, this whole idea that universities are busy teaching, they are busy teaching. But again, I can speak from personal experience of an ex-director of public health and colleagues within universities who have offered their services to help and been turned down. And this is in the last few weeks. They've been turned down for their help that they could offer. I do want to add to this. I know this is a little of a digression, but we can't ignore here that actually this whole thing about testing, etc., is now spreading into the flu vaccine. It's no secret that many GP surgeries and many hospitals have not been able to get hold of flu vaccines, and that's actually now adding to the problems. So who's suffering from this? The general population, of course. NHS staff are struggling to get tests. There is little regular asymptomatic testing, which causes a massive problem in hospitals, and sickness is already twice the normal rates in many northern cities, which is often due to staff self-isolating because they can't get a test. The Royal College of GPs has written saying that that patient care will suffer. And that well-known figure, supporter of Labour, that's Jeremy Hunt, the Parliamentary Health and Social Care Committee chair, has said himself, weekly testing for NHS staff has been repeatedly promised, but not delivered. The most vulnerable are not protected. The CQC has stated that testing for adults with autism and learning disabilities is really not good enough. Schools, 50% are sending students home now, and nearly 500,000 pupils are not in school. So why should it be local? Let's focus on how this could work. As has been mentioned already, 95% of contacts have been traced by local public health teams. It's been a successful system in Germany, where they do it through local public health teams. A good piece of research has also said that you can also educate people this way and actually help them to learn to self-isolate. I'm going to finish with a quote from a Conservative mayor, Andy Street. We need to have local control of test and trace system. A centralised system does not have the local expertise to be able to cut through and reach local communities. And Alison Pollock from SAGE said, it's beyond belief that despite clear evidence of a failing test and trace system, the government is not terminating these contracts and giving them to local public health teams who have shown to have to be highly effective. Thank you.
Councillor Milliken.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening. I mean, there clearly have been problems with getting the NHS track and trace system up and running. I don't think anybody could deny that. You could say it was too ambitious, but frankly, there was no blueprint to follow. This has not been done before. And it would seem that public health officials know their own areas and residents best. Now, despite what Councillor Rice says, Let's not forget that the government has provided unprecedented levels of public funding to support the economy, to keep people in jobs, and additional welfare payments. But funding should be switched so that local public health teams take a leading role in testing and contact tracing. Like I'm sure everyone here today does, I always tap in with NHS, the app, wherever I go, anywhere. And it's down to all of us to respond proactively if we are contacted and need to isolate. No ifs, no buts. We must volunteer the information and we must isolate properly if we are to beat this dreadful virus. Now, I support the principle behind this motion. I mean, you know, we're all agreeing with each other this evening on this motion. But I do urge this council to support our amendment. Prompt, accurate and universally available testing and tracing is needed for so many people right across our society. Until a vaccine is available, this really is a necessity. Now, teachers and staff in our schools need results quickly so they can get back to teaching if thankfully they don't have the virus. Police officers deal with the public in closer quarters than most, and so they need to be tested locally and quickly. And of course, those working in care homes, hospitals, health clinics need to be tested regularly with the results returned promptly. Now, according to a recent Guardian article, so I know that the Labour councillors will believe this to be gospel truth, France is struggling just the same as us with getting the system working well. Quoting from the Guardian article, in the United States, after a pretty disastrous start, tests are widely and quickly available in many places. It goes on. However, the picture is not uniform, and like other countries, it has seen capacity strained in places where infections are surging, with some areas seeing labs struggling to turn tests around within a week, badly undermining their usefulness. And in fact, there is more contact testing and contact tracing done in this country than elsewhere in Europe. Now, I appreciate this is no help to those who need it, but we are not alone in getting these systems up and running and working for everyone. We are all learning as we go along. So, Mr. Mayor, we support calls for local government and local public health teams to be given the appropriate emergency funding and powers needed to run test and trace locally. I welcome the £300 million announced last week by the Communities Secretary to support test and trace by local authorities, as well as funding allocated from the new local alert level system to support local councils through the winter.
30 seconds.
Thank you. And so this side of the chamber would be happy to support a letter to the Communities Secretary supporting his view that local knowledge is, quote, bound to be better at running test and trace. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Paul.
Thank you. I'd just like to say two things, Mr. Mayor. My own experience of track and trace and why this is so important. I needed a test last month and found none were available in Ealing on the system after multiple attempts. I heard Lib Dem MP Munira Wilson saying that her Twickenham constituents had been able to get a test by giving an Aberdeen postcode, so I gave it a try. When I entered a postcode starting AB, the system instantly gave me an appointment for the test centre at Aberdeen Airport. Rather than flying to Aberdeen, I simply drove to Featherstone Terrace car park in Southall and got tested, no problem, using the QR code I'd received. Thankfully, I was negative. So, was there a huge queue at Featherstone Terrace? No, quite the reverse. There were plenty of spare tables in the tent to get tested at, with helpful staff with nothing to do. So hundreds of local people need tests, while the local centres operate at a fraction of their capacity. How absurd is it that only those who know their way around the vagaries of the system can get tested? The system is broken, fundamentally broken. That's why we agree with this motion, but it's a national tragedy that we still don't have a testing system that works. The second thing I'd like to say is why this is so important. International comparisons show us doing much, much worse than the vast majority of comparable countries in terms of both cases and deaths. In terms of deaths per 100,000 people, we are tragically on a par with Trump's America. What we see is that countries like South Korea that really do have a world-beating track and trace system have suffered a fraction of the deaths we have. So, Mr. Mayor, thousands of lives are at stake. We can and must do better. We must involve councils with their public health expertise and not just consultancy companies. Please support this motion unanimously.
Thank you, Paul. Councillor Paul. Councillor Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I am one for unpopular opinions, Mr. Mayor, and one of those opinions that I hold is that I'm a supporter of the House of Lords. That is because I see the potential for some very talented people with useful skills to be appointed into the Lords who might not otherwise make it through party selection processes and into the House of Commons. The NHS, or rather the Serco, test and trace, has rather shaken my view. As if the failures of Baroness Dido Harding were not enough when she was at Talk Talk. She is, of course, now supposed to be protecting our great nation from the further threat of COVID. Well, perhaps membership of the House of Lords is no guarantor of ability after all. And ability does matter. A leaked email from the 21st of October tells us that Serco employed test and trace call centre staff and they're taking on roles intended for clinically trained people. Is this what we are paying £1 billion for to Serco and Citow? A service which is expecting too much of its staff. A service which, according to data published last Thursday, had its lowest weekly figure with fewer than 60% of close contacts of people who tested positive being reached. A service which is basically an Excel spreadsheet and not fit for purpose. People are really struggling to get a test at all, and many are being sent to opposite ends of the country. And when they do obtain that elusive test, just 15.1% of people who were tested for COVID-19 in England in the week ending 14th of October at a so-called in-person test received their result within 24 hours. This was down 32.8% since the week before. Prime Minister Boris Johnson had previously promised in-person tests would all be returned within a 24-hour timeframe by the end of June. Perhaps such promises go the way of COVID marshals and moonshot. Great sounding ideas, but beyond the competence of our government and those chosen ones who take on all the lucrative contracts. So let us get away from those who will increase their profits by £20 million during a pandemic, which has claimed 400 lives in Ealing, and maybe instead rely on those with a track record for serving the public during these times. Those who fed the shielding, those who kitted out the care homes with PPE, our local council staff who created services from scratch which could compete with any in the world. This is a matter of urgency. Cut the ideology which puts Tory faith in Tory friends in the private sector over the local knowledge of our local authorities. Dido Harding had promised that she would remain neutral in the House of Lords, although despite this, she voted with the government's immigration plans. No wonder the GMB union called for Baroness Harding to resign immediately. In 2017, Baroness Harding said, "I am really a big believer in chief executives not staying forever." She went on to say, "I've always been of the view that two-term presidency rule is a pretty good one, and CEOs shouldn't overstay their welcome." Well, Baroness, time to practice what you preach, as Serco has overstayed its welcome running our test and trace. Time for the truly talented and able to take over. Our Ealing Council staff. Thank you.
Councillor Dinster.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, many years ago, when I first came to this country, I had basic knowledge of English, but had no knowledge of English slangs. But pretty soon, I learned a wonderful English slang. Can't organize a blank in a brewery, which, Mr. Mayor, may be an appropriate metaphor for the test and trace mess we find ourselves in this country. Mr. Mayor, in the last 60-70 years, whenever there was a crisis, the world looked upon two great nations, United Kingdom and USA. But the two incumbents, through their handling of the pandemic, had made these two countries the laughing stock of the world. Mr. Mayor, we now know that the elderly were excluded from hospital and intensive care treatment during the peak of COVID-19. An InSight investigation revealed that the triage tool was used to prevent many elderly from receiving ventilation and intensive care. Documents revealed that the over 80s were excluded. Mr. Mayor, over 80s made 60% of the total deaths, but only 2.5% of those were given access to intensive care in spite of critical beds being empty. Mr. Mayor, documents also show that half the over 60s were also denied intensive care treatment. The country COVID-19 testing system is in disarray. The completed swabs are being sent to laboratories in Italy and Germany for testing. Across the country, people are being asked to travel hundreds of miles to get a test. In comparison, Germany, South Korea, people are tested at railway stations, superstores, shopping malls, etc. But testing, Mr. Mayor, is one step towards slowing the transmission. Test, trace, and isolate. The world-beating system, launched by the Prime Minister and overseen by his aristocratic friend, Baroness Harding, has stumbled from one crisis to another, thus undermining the government's whole coronavirus strategy. The failure of the test and trace is due to the government's decision to outsource it to private companies with absolutely no experience, large contracts given without competitive tendering. Serco and Cyto, the two firms hired by the government to run the National Test and Trace program, are set to receive over $1 billion of taxpayers' money. Private enterprise at public expense. Their poorly performing test and trace system only reached 68.6% of contacts. In comparison, the system ran by local authorities reached staggering 97.1% of contacts. It's quite clear from the statistics that local councils, local health teams are much better at it than private companies. And I feel it's high time that the government hand over the resources and responsibilities to local authorities because they can do it better, are doing it better, and I urge you to support the motion. Thank you.
D. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to start by expressing my condolences to the 400 people in Ealing, over 400 people in Ealing now who've lost their lives due to coronavirus. There will be family members, friends, and colleagues who will not be at the dining table, at work, at family gatherings, and at social meetups for years to come. And I'm sure we all wish to send our condolences to those people. I won't repeat a lot of what my colleagues and indeed most of the general debate has said about this. I only despair of the fact now that Conservative members of this authority have suddenly recognised the importance of well-resourced and attentive local public health teams. It's something that we've been calling for the best part of a decade, while austerity cuts have damaged the impact that local, well-funded and well-resourced public health teams can deliver to their local communities. Test and trace is a disaster. It's been a disaster from its inception. At the beginning, there wasn't enough for the contract tracers to do, so they weren't able to meet their targets and make their phone calls. And now we have the absurd situation where there now aren't enough contract tracers to trace the contacts that need to be made. So we now have a position where part-time staff and ill-equipped staff are trying to catch up with the surge in cases. And I agree with the Conservative colleagues who've said that this shouldn't be a political issue. Providing local residents with adequate information, the best possible advice and access to tests where they need it should be our first step, and entirely uncontroversial in dealing with a global pandemic. Unfortunately, the system that has been set up has failed on countless occasions. Councillor Rye spoke earlier on about the 3 data breaches that hit this system within weeks. We haven't really talked about the bizarre idea of storing all the contacts on one Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, something that a GCSE student would know was doomed to fail. And I do have to pick up Councillor Young on 2 of his points. The first, as Councillor Dinter has just referred to, the latest data from last week shows that the percentage of tracing is now below 60%. As other colleagues have said, that is simply not acceptable or world beating. The other is, I've heard this, and it was suggested by Nadeem Sahavi in a magnificent, thank you, in a magnificent media round this morning. It was suggested by Nadeem Sahavi that we'd set up this system worthy of Tesco from scratch. All I would say is, if the CEO of Tesco had presided over such a shocking disaster, they would have been fired or pressured to resign by their shareholders. In conclusion, we've heard from our local public health experts that they need more access to data and they need more influence over the decisions that are being taken to combat the virus. That's what we need to do. That's why we need to support this motion. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. We are almost 10 to 10. I need some advice. Sam, shall we go straight to the vote, or shall I give you extra 4 minutes each?
Mr. Mayor, if you would allow the, I'm sure if you would allow the mover of the motion and the mover of the amendment to sum up, I'm sure we'll be fine to do that and to conclude the meeting following that by going to the vote on everything.
Okay, fine, thanks. Yeah, Councillor Stafford, sum up the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I'll be very brief. I think we've been, on this side, on the Conservative group, we recognise the problems of test and trace, and we don't think that they are acceptable. And we do think that the government needs to fully resource and appropriately resource, both at a national level and in the context of this motion, at a local level, test and trace, which is why generally we are supportive of the motion. I didn't say, as Councillor Blacker has just tweeted, that everything was great. It clearly hasn't been great, but I do think we do need to recognise those people who have been making an effort, and to just denigrate the whole thing as a disaster does not recognise the hard work of thousands and thousands of people who work on test and trace. So I think we need to be clear on that. I think we also all need to recognise that test and trace is only part of the solution, especially with a pandemic where a vast proportion of those people with the virus don't have any symptoms, and therefore are unlikely to go to be tested. And therefore, in reality, a mass testing of the population, probably without a vaccine, if we assume we haven't got a vaccine, is probably the only way that we will get out of the lockdowns. So again, I think test and trace is important, but test is probably as important, if not more important, given the asymptomatic nature of the virus. But in conclusion, Mr. Mayor, I also express my condolences to all those who've been affected by the virus. I think as a council, we have essentially said the same things tonight, that we need to fund local test and trace appropriately, and I hope that we can do so without the mudslinging that potentially we've seen from some councillors this evening. So vote for our amendment, and together we can work together for the people of Ealing. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Stafford. Councillor Rye, sum up.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, councillors, I'm really pleased to see that Councillor Stafford, Councillor Young, Milliken have all accepted that there have been problems with the test and trace system. Yes, the testing numbers continue to increase, and yes, I would expect them to increase over time. But the fact is that they've not met their own KPIs for a safe health response for those people testing positive. So let's not forget that. And in terms of political mudslinging, as Councillor Stafford just put it, I think it's fair to say that from where I sit, I've presented the situation as I see it. And I agree with him that we should all be working together to fight this pandemic. And that's exactly what we're trying to do by laying the facts bare at this meeting. Whilst we welcome the government funding nationally of the 300 million for a local test and trace service locally, it certainly pales into total insignificance when you look at what the private sector has received. As Councillor Burke pointed out, the procurement was deeply flawed. There's been no transparency with these £1 billion contracts. And how can you have faith in a system that lacks transparency, but it also fails at the same time? We get a double whammy here. As Councillor Busuttil said, it's too late, too little, and time again, this pandemic has tested this government, and time again, it's failed. And I would agree with Councillor Rice that Dido Harding needs to go. We've all seen numbers increase from July this year, which I believe could have been mitigated with greater local involvement earlier on and greater recognition by this government that it wasn't performing and it needed to perform. It just hasn't risen to the challenge of this pandemic. We do have to also ask why on the Test and Trace Board we didn't have data scientists, GPs, nurses, community mobilisation experts, behavioural scientists, virologists, and the list goes on. These are people that we needed there if we were to truly roll out what I would term as a successful, well thought through national service. It could have been done. I still believe that we would have done it differently, but we all know that this Prime Minister doesn't have an eye for detail. And again, it shows. Councillor Milliken says it's up to us to isolate properly if we are to beat the virus. Councillor Milliken, I have a friend who tested positive, and all this friend's contacts have yet to be contacted by Test and Trace, and this friend is about to come out of quarantine. The bottom line is that we in local government continue to try and pick up on national failures, and yet we're constantly being hit by austerity measures by the government. You know, let's have a level playing field. It's shameful that, as Councillor Dinder says, testing is in disarray, to put it mildly. In comparison with other countries, we've not performed at all. They've all found more creative ways of contacting and reaching people and doing the best that they can. We need to do better. And on that note, I would ask members of the council to support the motion before them.
Thank you very much. I will now ask the whips from the parties to indicate their parties' votes on amendment. Councillor Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The Labour Group are going to vote against the amendment.
Does anyone wish to vote differently to the indication of their whip? Councillor Milliken, how will the Conservative Group vote on the amendment?
Well, we support the amendment.
Does anyone wish to vote differently to the indication of their whip? Councillor Ball, how will the Liberal Democratic Group vote on the amendment?
The Liberal Democrat Group will vote against the amendment, Mr. Mayor.
Does anyone wish to vote differently to the indication of their whip? The amendment therefore falls. I will now move to the vote on the motion. Councillor Gordon.
The Labour Group votes for the motion.
Does anyone wish to vote differently to the indication of their whip? Councillor Milliken, how will the Conservative Group vote on the motion?
The Conservative Group supports the motion.
Does anyone wish to vote differently to the indication of their whip? Councillor Ball, how will the Liberal Democratic Group vote on the motion?
The Liberal Democrat Group also votes for the motion, Mr. Mayor.
Does anyone wish to vote differently to the indication of their whip? The motion therefore is carried. Let me.
Item 30, Mr. Minister.
We have 2 minutes, so I think no more discussion about it.
Yeah, we just move straight to item 13 and then Mr. Mayor and then run through all the votes on the items as indicated.
And here it says, before we move to the vote, motion not for debate, can my clerk confirm the Councillor Rooney has rejoined the meeting?
I'm just checking the attendance list.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm back in the meeting now.
Yes, Councillor Rooney just confirmed for herself.
We'll
Thank
now
you.
move into the vote on the motion. Councillor Gordon?
Yes, Labour Group votes for the motion.
Does anyone wish to vote differently to the indication of their whip? Councillor Millican, how will the Council Group vote on the motion?
We support the motion. Vote for the motion.
Does anyone wish to vote differently to the indication of their whip? Councillor Ball, how will the Liberal Democratic Group vote on the motion?
We also support the motion, Mr. Mayor.
Does anyone wish to vote differently to the indication of their whip? The motion is therefore carried. Okay, so 14. Treasury management meeting. Are the recommendations in the report carried? Yes.
If members could indicate a general assent, that would be
Agreed.
helpful.
Agreed.
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 If the decision is exempted from fall-in, are the urgent key decision expected from fall-in noted?
Agreed.
Noted and agreed.
Mr.
Mayor.
Agreed. The appointments to the committees and their bodies, appointments to the committees and outside bodies were regulated today. Are the appointments to the committee and outside bodies agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Date for the next meeting. The next meeting will take place on 15th December 2020. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, councillors. Have a good evening.
Good night, Deputy Mayor. Good night, Mayor.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Safe journey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.